Good morning, dear friends of Arctic science. It's time for the first panel. My name is Peter Sköld. You can read everything behind me, of course. The name of this panel is Conditions for Livelihoods, Health and Ecosystems in the Arctic. I'm a professor at Umeå University. My relation to the theme is perhaps that I've spent quite a lot of time studying the Sami health transition, which is a very fascinating and unique in the world of indigenous peoples story. We might connect to that. But first of all today, I welcome Gia Destouni from Stockholm University, presenting climate sensitivity of infectious diseases in the changing north. Welcome, Gia.
Thank you. Let me accustom myself to this. There is a pointer. I was told point here, but
Oh, yeah.
yes. But you, oh yes, it works. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Very happy to see you here this early morning. I'm a climate and water scientist, and today I'm going to talk about their role in infectious disease around the Nordic and Arctic region. And many people have been involved in the work that I'm going to just give some highlights of today. You see the names here, and they are all part of a project called CLINF. So CLINF is about climate change effects on the epidemiology of infectious disease and the impacts on northern societies. So my focus here is the link between climate and diseases. And there are a set of things that we challenged and targeted and challenged in this work that I will highlight today. And one of them is the discussions about climate sensitivity of infectious diseases. There are many of them, but they tend to be just qualitative. There is a reasoning about which diseases might be climate sensitive. And what we wanted to do here is to be quantitative, to see what the data say about this, to actually try to quantify this relationship. And then when you do that, you also see a couple of other things. First of all, that in the qualitative discussions, people tend to mean by climate sensitivity to temperature, if it gets warmer or colder, which it doesn't. But so one of the things we wanted to see here is the multidimensionality and higher complexity than just temperature disease. And a third thing that comes up then when you look at that is the issue of scale, because when you just talk descriptively about these relationships, it seems like if they are general and not locality, geographically dependent and scale dependent, which they actually are. And those are the things, the work on these types of things that I will highlight and exemplify today. So this is the CLINF team at our kickoff meeting. And what you see to the left is an example of a database we built up in the CLINF project. And that is a major important legacy of the project. So around the Nordic Arctic region, we have been able to map disease incidence for various diseases. You see here tularemia example. And the mapping is actually per county, so it's much finer resolution than you see with the different colors here. But the different colors show how we have been working with that, because we have wanted to go to larger scales than just each locality per se. And we were lucky in this work because while we had this project, our Russian colleagues could still participate and played an important role in mapping disease occurrences around Russia and Siberia. So that's part of the database, the CLINF database that we have been building up. And then we have used this database to look at the temporal evolution of different diseases. And you see the ones that we have had data on and for how long. And you can see the curves here, the evolution of their annual incidence over the time period of study. And the time period of study is determined by the time that we have data for. So then we have the disease occurrences, and you can see some descriptions of these different diseases here, and they are different in many different ways. I'm not going to go through that. You can read it. But over the same time, we also know how climate has changed. And you see here examples of mean temperature and mean precipitation. The thick line is how that has evolved over the whole region in this study period. And then you see thinner lines for different sub-regions, countries, and parts of countries within this region. So now our focus here is on the links between these climate and disease occurrences. And to start with, we then look at the different diseases, how they have evolved over time. And you see here two of them, which is Lyme disease, borreliosis, and cryptosporidiosis. These are grouped together because they show similar type of evolution. You see increase over the whole region and in different parts of the region during this time period. But that's not the only type of behavior you see. You see here then a couple of other diseases, TB and leptospiroidiosis, that show an opposite evolutions over this time. So here you have decrease in incidences over the time of the study period. And you also have diseases that show no significant trend. Variations, yes, but no clear trend over time. And here you have tularemia, pumalavirus infection, and Q fever. So we have different types of behavior here. So then our question is, how does that relate with the evolution and variations of climate in this period? Then again, we look at all these diseases, and there you can also see that it's not just climate and disease, it's various climate aspects, it's water aspects, it's land aspects, and a multidimensionality of these different aspects also that link with the climate. So what we have done is to screen through a huge number of variables, climate variables, and look at their correlation with the different diseases over the study period. So let's have a look at what that looks like. We have here type 2 diseases that turned out to be primarily temperature related. But even when saying that, you see that first of all they have different so one, the borreliosis, Lyme disease, has positive correlation, and that is with the climate variable that's autumn temperature. And then you have leptospiroidiosis that has negative correlations, so it decreases as spring temperature increases. So again, you have very different types of behaviors, and this shows that climate sensitivity we tend to, when we just discuss about it, we tend to talk about it as if, well, when it gets warmer, everything will be worse. But that's not really what it looks like, and you have different types of behaviors. And you have to go into specifics of seasonality and to understand what part of climate plays a role for the different diseases. Then we have 3 diseases that turned out to be water-related. We have TBE that relates mostly to spring precipitation, Q fever that relates to annual minimum monthly precipitation, and Pumala-virus infection that relates to annual maximum monthly precipitation. And again, there are you can see positive and negative correlations with changes in these. By the way, both here and with the previous diseases that I showed, Lyme disease and what was it, leptospiroidosis, you could see that there are very high degrees of correlation. So there is high power of explanation in these variables. And we have tested, these are the best among many that we have tested for each disease. And then we have cryptosporidiosis that relates to both, actually. It relates best to mean temperature of the wettest quarter. So it's both water and temperature related. And finally, tularemia, which shows no significant dependence or trend on regional scale and very high variability on local scale, different types of trends and dependencies of the same disease. So tularemia, it has been special in the CLIMF project because it has been the model disease that we have done many different investigations of. And I will try to decipher these dependencies of tularemia later on. But let's summarize a few things now from this whole region scale investigations for all the different types of diseases. So what we have done is identify disease trends without considering societal interventions, and that's a clear limitation of this study. But our reasoning, because their incidents do also depend on societal conditions. But the point is that we can still learn from this, first of all, because we see high explanatory power, even if we don't look at each detail in each process and mechanism. And when seeing such clear disease trends that we see for some of the diseases, then we can understand the needs for societal interventions as things change towards the future in order to avoid and turn negative developments like vaccine campaigns and information campaigns and things like that. Then we see a variety of different trends. We have increasing trends, we have not significant trends, we have decreasing trends in the various diseases. So climate sensitivity is just the first step to understanding climate dependencies. It doesn't mean a specific type of trend and dependence. You have to dig deeper to understand what kind of dependencies you have. And we see that those trends relate to various climate and other environmental variables. So it's not just temperature. The qualitative discussions and reasoning tends to be, oh, it gets warmer, therefore this will happen. That's not what it looks like when you look at the data. And then we also see a very large spatial variability in local scale disease incidence. So for some of the diseases, we also see convergence on large scales. We see similar types of trends, and then they converge to a clear regional scale trend for the different, for some of the diseases. But other diseases like tularemia do not at all show this convergence. So you have lots of variability on in different directions. So then to dissect this scale and locality dependence a bit more, we looked closer into tularemia. And as I said, this has been a model disease for various types of studies in CLINF. And what we wanted to look at here is the scale and geographic dependence of the sensitivity of this disease to climate and other type of environmental change. So here we now focused in on Sweden, and we wanted to look at both current conditions, and basically other people have looked into the current conditions, and we wanted to see how we could project these dependencies into the future and what the dependencies imply for future evolution. So what we could take from other people's work who understand the diseases a bit more, have studied the actual diseases more, is that we have established local scale statistical disease models that relate to different climate, water, landscape variables for these different counties that you see in Sweden, and they have been identified already before as hotspots for tularemia outbreaks. These statistical models have been developed based on actual monitor surveillance data, and we have corresponding data for climate and other environmental variables that we can relate to this. And we have also, these are the types of variables that you can get from global climate models. And to try to project evolution into the future. And that is what we have done, to look at the implications for future disease evolution. And I'm not going to go into the details, but this is just one example for one of the counties, what climate has looked like, the evolution of climate, or not has looked like, but is projected to look like in the future. And the projections are from different types of Earth system or climate, global climate models. And we have extracted from these the variables that are important for the tularemia as implied by the statistical disease models. So you have summer temperature, summer precipitation, and then you have relative mosquito abundance, which is a variable that in turn relates to mean temperature and mean river flows in different specific periods over the year, and you can see their evolution here. And what does that then imply for projections for the future of the disease? So you have three examples here that show very different behaviors. So you have, first of all, the thick lines of different colors here refer to different scenarios of future climate and, in fact, socioeconomic evolution. So that's called the SSP scenarios. And then you have the shaded fields around these, which show the uncertainty in this modeling, which can be huge for some. So the uncertainty, the variation between different models in these projections. But still, we can see, for example, for Jämtland, we can see a steeply increasing projection for the future, even though we high uncertainty around it. We see for Dalarna a much more uncertain situation where you have one scenario showing increase, another showing decrease, and we don't know where things will end up. And then you see Gävleborg, where there is lots of variability and uncertainty, but still they are all indicate a similar type of behaviors. So we have highly divergent type of changes in future outbreaks of tularemia, according to these projections across Sweden. And one thing to realize is that scenarios of steeper future climate warming do not at all necessarily lead to steeper increase of future disease outbreaks. And there are large intermodal uncertainties in this that we need to work further with. So finally, here you can see the CLINF team at a later meeting. And I just want to point out the interdisciplinarity of this research team. You see all kinds of different disciplines represented. And that has been great because that has been a basis for being able to do research like this. But it has also been very, very difficult to start speaking the same language, understand each other, and in fact starting to collaborate. And that started to happen by around the time that the project ended, unfortunately. We talked yesterday about the short-term funding that starts things, and then it's very difficult to go further than in very important types of research. And this applies here too. And unfortunately also COVID came at the end that made things even more difficult. You will hear from Grete later a bit some other aspects of this project, but I'm finished now. Thank you.
It's time to move on, and I welcome Timothy Heleniak to the stage, presenting population living on permafrost in the Arctic.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, as Peter said, the title of my talk is Population. Oops. Okay. No? Okay, Population on Permafrost in the Arctic. And this is my talk is based upon two different projects that I have been involved in. And this is one of them. I guess this is the people part. I have a project funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation called Polar Peoples, Past, Present, and Future, where I look at population trends in the Arctic going way back in time, focus a bit on the current period, and then also do some projections of the population of the Arctic going on into the future. Okay. The second project that I'm involved in is called Nunatak, and this is a screenshot from the web page of the project, and this is looking at permafrost thaw across the Arctic. And I have another colleague, Gustaf, who will talk in the next session. We haven't rehearsed our talks. Hopefully they'll be quite different. Anyway, so this is the permafrost part of what I'm going to be talking about. What this project is looking at, and this is, I should say, is funded by the Horizon program, European Commission. So we bring together a lot of specialists in natural sciences, social sciences. We're trying to quantify the fluxes and looking at coastal thawing, permafrost. And we'll try to look at what the effects of this will be on infrastructure, indigenous local communities. And that's kind of what I'm going to be focusing on, that small part of it. And then we try to use this, what we find in this, to look at the long-term impacts on global climate and the economy. But like I said, I'm going to be focused on one kind of narrow aspect of this project. So Nordregio's role, and Nordregio, I should say, is the long name is the Nordic Center for Spatial Development. We're an institute here, based here in Stockholm, under the Nordic Council of Ministers, and we do a lot of policy relevant research. And what we Our role in the project is data and mapping of population, economy, and infrastructure in the Arctic, and we're quite well known for the mapping we do. And this is just one example we put together early in the project, an atlas of population, society, and the economy. So we tried to gather data on all of these different aspects. We also did field work in Greenland. I didn't do a lot of this. A colleague of mine, Liselotte Odgaard, did this, and I should acknowledge some of them. Justine Ramage also was a colleague at Nordregio, and she's actually moving to Stockholm University rather soon. So if you want more information, you can go to nordregio.org, and you can get a lot of our maps and different publications there. So these are just some examples, probably well known to this audience, of the effects of permafrost thaw on roads, railroads, houses, etc. And obviously these are accelerating over time. And basically the bottom line is the starting point for this study is to calculate the number of people living on permafrost and different types of permafrost as kind of a starting point to look at the impact of permafrost thaw going forward into the future. And so what we did, I mean, quite literally, if you are experienced with GIS, we took people and put them on permafrost, I mean, basically. And this was part of our project, and it's something that hadn't been done before. So what we did is we started by getting a good map of the permafrost layer. And you can see here the different types of permafrost, and I'll mention something in a second, but the darker purple are the continuous permafrost, and as the shades go down, it's down to discontinuous or sporadic permafrost. But the one takeaway, and I'll mention this in a second, is a lot of the permafrost, or the continuous permafrost, of course, is in Russia, extending into Siberia, which has a slightly different temperature regime than other places. And a lot of the large cities, Russia, the Soviet Union, I mean, developed its northern Arctic regions in a quite different manner than other places. And so they built a lot of rather large cities in different parts of the Arctic, as opposed to, what do you want to say, Western countries did. So what we did was, like I said, we combined demographic data to show the current settlement structure in order to kind of quantify how many people would be affected by permafrost thaw. And one trend that seems to be kind of percolating through a lot of these talks is data, maybe not how bad, but problems we have with our data. And believe me, you think population data is simple, it's not. I mean, collecting data, there's quite different statistical systems in these countries, so just finding out the number of people is not as easy as it seems, but we did it. And so this is kind of the number of settlements in different places in the Arctic on permafrost. And these are the different permafrost zones, like I said, going from continuous down to sporadic, and the settlements that were on these different types of different on permafrost, and then on the different types of permafrost. And what we also did was we combined the permafrost extent with the hazards, dividing these up into high, low, and medium, and I won't get into this, but I mean the high is those that more susceptible to permafrost thaw than some of the other places, down to low. And so we did kind of this matrix of types of permafrost with different hazards. And so what we show is we quantified and said there's roughly 5 million people that live on one type of permafrost or another, and about 42% of these settlements will become permafrost free by the year 2060. And in Greenland, of course, a lot of settlements on the coast are on permafrost, and all but a few will be permafrost free by the year 2060. So the second kind of question is, what is the adaptive capacity to manage this permafrost degradation? And this shows, this is maybe a little bit better, the map, the large map shows, well, it shows the population size and then the population change over the previous 10 years. And we did this in about 2019, 2020, so we used 2017 as kind of the baseline. And you can see some of the large settlements, Anchorage, obviously in Alaska, Reykjavik, but that's not on permafrost. And then you can see some of the ones in Russia, Norilsk and some of the other large settlements. So what we say is about 5 million people are living on permafrost right now in about 1,200 different settlements, and the total number of people is expected to decline by about 61% from 5 million to 1.7 million. So about 3.3 million people who now live on a place where it's built on permafrost will degrade and ultimately disappear in a lot of these settlements. And like I said, in the project, we look at a lot of coastal settlements because they have even a stronger effect from the permafrost thaw. So this is the quantitative part of my talk, and I'm going to move on to the more qualitative. And this is, like I said, based on fieldwork in western Greenland, done by my colleague Liselotte Odgaard. And we investigate several different types of adaptation. Autonomous, that's kind of local level or at the family level adaptation to permafrost thaw, more kind of planned, longer term adaptation. And we asked the question, what is the adaptive capacity to manage this permafrost thaw in northwest Greenland? And so what she did and several trips and other people did is we did a couple surveys, a lot of focus groups, and a lot of interviews talking to people in these different settlements in 2019, and actually she was there in March of 2020, just before the pandemic started, and had to leave. So she reviewed a lot of municipal planning strategies, talked to people to try and get an idea of what was the available knowledge to be able to manage and inform decision-making about permafrost thaw. Like I said, most of this. So we did a couple of surveys also, asking people some questions about their attitudes and their kind of adaptation strategies. What measures were they undertaking to mitigate or deal with the permafrost thaw? This is just one highlight from the surveys that we did, or that we carried out about what was in these different areas in hunting, fishing, housing, economy, what were the current or expected impacts, and you can see here kind of all of them. It's interesting, the one that the highest number of don't know questions was the economy. I mean, how would the economy be, or your local economy be affected by permafrost thaw? And these are just some quotes from some of the interviews. I mean, you've probably all seen these round holes in some of the trails, more landslides than before. Old hunting cabins have been washed away by drifting water into the coast. So like I said, we try to look at this at different geographic scales with different methods. So some of the mitigation measures, I guess, or adaptation measures, homeowners talked a lot about some of these different issues, having to kind of fix doors when the foundation buckles, and those. And so these are some of the more autonomous measures that people have taken. Individual homeowners have to do this kind of at their own expense. And then some of the more institutional organization, a lot of the public infrastructure, roads, we've seen a lot of these. These comprise a rather large challenge. Repairing old buildings, carried out kind of on an ad hoc way, and it's not always easy to plan for the cost of this. And then, when you build a new building, more and more of these are built on bedrock, less susceptible to permafrost thaw. Some of the scientific knowledge, I mean, this shows, these two charts show the temperature maximum, minimum, and average for the active layer, and then kind of down lower, you can see here kind of the range. And certainly, obviously, the biggest range is the active layer, which thaws and freezes over time. Yeah, so we also we tried to zoom in and did some projections of the active layer for these two different settlements. And you can see the red shows those places that will, the difference between our baseline and the kind of projected. So those places in red will thaw actually a bit quicker. You can see 0 to 10 centimeters for these two places. But the local planners said even this was a bit too coarse for their planning. I mean, the first part of my talk was about the kind of Arctic level permafrost and its changes, and this is even at a more local scale for these two settlements, and they even said this was a little too coarse. They wanted something a little bit more precise even than this. So some of the conclusions, some of the knowledge to support the adaptive capacity. Like I said, there are several limitations to this. Lack of consistent local data collection to form kind of a regional database upon which to be able to plan for the future, what it's going to look like. So some of the key results, community members, like I said, do a lot of this adaptation themselves with support from family or friends. The municipalities also, in a lot of cases in Northwest Greenland, engage in autonomous or kind of spontaneous adaptive capacities, especially to roads, public infrastructure. So there's a gap, again, between the kind of scientific knowledge and what these people actually need to be able to plan for the future and manage this permafrost change. If you would like, we have a couple of articles that we've written. The one on the left, permafrost, a population living on permafrost in the Arctic, is the more quantitative part. So that's corresponds to the first part of my talk, and then this one in the Journal Polar Geography, Adaptive Capacity, deals with the more qualitative aspects that I mentioned. And one thing to look forward to is later on in this project, we, I think next spring sometime, is an Arctic Permafrost Atlas, and I have been, and people at Nordregio, actually this is a huge kind of team effort to give these people at Grid Arendal data, and I've seen various drafts of this that have come out and been in various discussions, and you can see that the team with all these sticky notes here about what to change, what not to change. And I just show a couple samples. I mean, they're really moving from different geographic scales with me as a geographer. That's kind of really cool. But this should be a quite interesting and product to look forward to. There's going to be a print edition and also a digital edition of this that'll come out, I think, in next May, roughly. So this is certainly something to look forward to, and it's something that I think all of us will enjoy when it comes out. So thank you very much for that.
It's time for me to welcome Grete Hovelsrud, Nordland University of Norway, also representing the Norwegian Scientific Academy for Polar Research. Welcome, Grete.
Thank you, Peter. That was a nice lead-in to my talk. Wonder if it was planned? Yes, thank you. I'm going to talk about a follow-up on, or an aspect of the CLINT project that Gia introduced about climate-sensitive infections and Arctic pastoralism. But we need to sort of bring our minds to what do you do when you study climate change impacts of Arctic people? So what do you have to consider? That there are multiple Arctics, there's not one, that there are 40 different indigenous peoples in the Arctic, and that there are high diversity between and within countries. So the responses to climate change, adaptation, transformation, and mitigation will be very different. And there are, of course, a diversity of adaptation options and strategies for each of these, given the different contexts. So the answer to the question on climate change impacts on people and society will have many answers. There has been, I wanted to take you through this social science and climate change, how it sort of, where it started to come on the agenda. And there's a progression here. The Arctic Climate Impact Assessment in 2004, it was the first major concerted effort to try to understand the complexities of Arctic climate change impacts on local communities. There are some chapters there. I was part of this work, and we didn't quite know how to think about this. As an anthropologist, it wasn't new to me that communities adapt to changes or to conditions. But how do you actually think about it in the climate change setting? In the IPY International Polar Year 2007-2008, we cemented the strong need for Arctic social sciences in climate research. We had an impact on how we think about the drivers of change, the scaling and communication of climate change models and projections. And that was a very interesting effort in its own right. I was searching for Jörn here and the users of this kind of information. In 2011, the snow, water, ice, and permafrost in the Arctic report came out, a big, thick thing. And there we concluded that Arctic peoples are resilient and active rather than passive actors. There had been a tendency to talk about people as if some climate change was something that happened to them and made them vulnerable, as if they didn't have the tools and the know-how or the knowledge to actually address these changes. We're talking about the Arctic, where people have lived for 4,000 years and have adapted to quite different variability and also to very different climate and environmental conditions. And then we also developed local and regional projections of cryosphere change, which has been very useful, of which thawing permafrost, of course, is one. In IPCC AR5 and the working group that I was a lead author, on the human security issues from 2014, we moved from the sort of the technological or economic thinking about climate change impacts and into more the values, the cultural values, and how does that play a role in our research? How do we bring it in? And we are now digging deeper and deeper into the micro level and moving further and further away from the Arctic and into the multiple Arctics. We also found in reading about the 1,000 abstracts or something that I was responsible for with indigenous knowledge, we saw that it's, of course, often neglected in adaptation policy and research. Hence, well, actually not hence, I want to talk about the adaptation in the changing Arctic, where this sort of started to come to the fore in 2017. And here we talked about adaptation options. So we moved from impacts to talking about options in the light of the changing conditions. And mine, it says social and environmental conditions. We're sort of bringing it more and more together into this multiple stressor, social ecological system framework, and that the local context is critical. We said this in this report, and of course we have known this, but we haven't had it presented in this way. But I wanted to take us through this idea of traditional knowledge. It pops up everywhere as it does the co-production, co-creation, but what is it that we actually, why do we talk about traditional and scientific knowledge, and why are both forms of knowledge in research and decision-making important? I will get to that later. And what are the challenges? When we say there are multiple Arctics, when we say that the local context is critical, how do we then, where is the traditional knowledge located, and how do we get to it? I will use some examples from the study, the CLINF study of climate-sensitive infections and pastoralism, to illustrate how we have been working with this. And I will also touch upon the transdisciplinarity of this, which is what happens when you have different scientific knowledges or disciplines merging. That's interdisciplinary. When you bring in communities and decision makers, you are in the transdisciplinary domain. And that is That's where co-production of knowledge really happens. Traditional knowledge, what is that? Well, it has been defined by the World Intellectual Property Organization, who owns this term. It's knowledge, is know-how, skills, and practices that are developed, sustained, and passed on from generation to generation within a community, often forming a part of its cultural or spiritual identity. It's deep. It's deep. Scientific knowledge is also deep, but it's deep in a different way. And we know that some of us, the ability to take a project further depends on funding. So we don't necessarily get the depth. This is much deeper historically. And it's closely linked to nature and resources, practice, and management naturally. And it's embedded and expressed through language, so and practice, obviously. But it's something that sits deep in a culture. And it's not just indigenous peoples who hold this knowledge. Also local knowledge has equal depth. I've been working in local communities without indigenous peoples, and I find many of the similar ways of knowing. So if we study climate change impacts and we bring in knowledge, so we talk about multiple forms of knowledge: scientific, traditional, local, traditional, ecological knowledge, expert knowledge, experience-based knowledge. There are many terms here, and they all work depending on how you want to write it, of course. But the issue here is how you integrate. And is there a hierarchy? Is there a power dimension here? That's a rhetorical question, by the way. And the understanding how they differ and what they're used for is also a very important part of thinking about traditional knowledge. And again, it's situated in culture, practice, application, and co-production. And when do we engage local traditional knowledge holders? Are there any pitfalls here? Well, ideally from the project design phase through collaboration and what we call deep listening. That is not a hippie term. That actually is something, the deep listening of what people are actually saying. And so we know, sorry. I'm looking at Lars Otto because he usually has a lozenge in his pocket. If he continues to come, please give me one. Ideally, from the project design, what does that mean? Do you go into a community and ask them if they want to be part of a project? Is it possible to always do that? Do we have the resources? Do we risk a research fatigue? Especially because you are doing it in the project design before you have the money. And you may not get the money. And then what do? Go back and say 4 years later, do you want to do this again? How do we actually do this? And I argue with the Research Council of Norway all the time to say, it's a condition after you get the money to bring in the traditional local communities. Don't ask for it. Don't ask for letters at the proposal stage, because it's actually very difficult to come back again and again and ask for them to be included. Yeah, so the involvement and the excitement that we have felt, we designed this very good project, and the Sami herders are excited, the fishers in Lofoten are excited, and then we don't get funded. So what do we do then? That's one of the problems. We talk a lot about sustainable climate adaptation, and in the term sustainable, there is also a link to co-production. So I want to bring this up because that is the sort of the hottest term in climate adaptation research now, is the sustainable climate adaptation. Why? Because we can have something called maladaptation. And I will show you what that may look like in a reindeer herding community. Adaptation measures are sustainable when contributing towards social equity and environmental integrity. Big words. Adaptation measures are never neutral. They always come with trade-offs for something. Something will go when you do one thing. There are winners and losers. That's nothing new. I remember Terry Callahan talking about winners and losers years ago. I mean,
Magan, 15 years ago. He was very concerned with winners and losers. So the co-production here, it kind of dissolves the boundaries here between the domains and science and non-science. Ideally, it does. So to get to these, to understand what sustainable climate adaptation is, you need to communicate, translate, mediate, and mutual respect. And that is often not the case, because often traditional knowledge is dismissed as anecdotes and cannot be used. It's getting better. Martin, we talked a little bit about this yesterday, and it seems like it's getting better. Now, get back to the research where we've been doing this. This project on CLINF that Gia fortunately introduced so well. Our premise was that increasing temperatures are causing species to spread into new geographic areas. Warmer and wetter conditions, hot, dry, cold spells, may enable vector-borne infections to move further north and find new species. We worked on zoonotic infections, those that move between humans and animals, or actually from animals to humans rather. So the new climate-sensitive infections, we made that term up, and we don't know if it's sticking yet, I hope it will. Notably, zoonotic infections may pose new risks to both animal and human health. That was our premise in CLINF. Very nice, very interesting. So we had some papers where we looked at the spreading and the climate projections and what it had to do with management and how you manage. What we found, and this is a literature review, and it's based on how we picked the different diseases and on. And we looked at the climate projections, and we thought that the management will have to happen of vegetation changes, disease hosts, which is the animal population, and vectors. And it emerges as an important regulatory tool for reducing the spreading and thereby the risk. And yeah, you talked a little bit about this, that there has to be something in place. This was our take based on the literature and how that works with the projections. And then I'm moving into the tick-borne diseases, because talking to the epidemiologists and all these different people in the project, we decided that ticks, the Ixodus, whatever, the one that causes Borrelia or Lyme disease, we focused on that. Is this a challenge, we asked, for subarctic pastoralists? So we set out to find out whether increased pressures from climate-sensitive infections would affect pastoralists. By that I mean reindeer herders and sheep farmers. I will focus predominantly on the herders in this talk. We don't have time for both. But we also wondered, knowing that the multiple stressor framework still holds, how do CSIs interact with other challenges that they may meet? Those were our questions. And we co-produced knowledge. We worked with the herders and we interviewed the herders. We participated in herding practices. And also I put the sheep in because we also did that with the sheep farmers. But pastoralists and predominantly reindeer herders are concerned, we learned through co-production. We created maps. We had all kinds of discussions about the challenges that they meet. So there were three things, actually four things, but first three things that they were concerned with, and that's land fragmentation. That comes from windmills, cabins, roads, railroads, people, all these people doing skiing on mountaintops in Norway is a big thing now. Large carnivores, that's wolves, bears, and lynx. Not wolves necessarily in this area, but let's say bears and lynx and eagles. And then the locked pastures, and Jørn mentioned a little bit about that yesterday. These are conditions when you have multiple freeze-thaw events that increases with the changing climate conditions. It actually prevents the animals from getting through the ice layer. You see reindeer going like this, and they can't get to the food underneath the ice. Locked pastures, big thing. And it has happened all over the Arctic, or let's say Fennoscandia. In addition, the national management regime is another stressor that they are concerned with. It doesn't necessarily meet what the reindeer herders feel as important to them.
and I will get back to that. And we found that there were no apparent links between emerging CSIs and the salient multiple stressors experienced by the pastoralists. So how do you study something, the effects of something in a community when it's not a concern? And that was a very difficult thing. You have 5 years and you don't find the link. They didn't care about CSIs. So what do? So it's a research problem for now. And so we were turning every stone and trying to figure out, and with help from the CLINF team and with the help from the reindeer herders, not to the least, what they do now in the Sami community, reindeer herding community, they adapt by supplementary feeding their animals. That is because of what I said, the locked pastures, because of the carnivores, because of the land fragmentation. So they feed their animals in, they buy food for them. It's counterintuitive to Sami reindeer herding, which is a semi or nomadic practice. But this is what they have to do for their animals. This alters the animal behavior, and the reindeer get lazy. They don't want to go out and look for food. They have the food right there. You know, they're opportunistic. They stand behind the buildings in shade. They don't go up into the snow. So it alters animal behavior, it alters the land use, it alters the culture, and it increases the risk of animal infections and diseases, but not the ones that we had decided on in the project. So this took us several years actually, but what happened is that when you have a lot of animals together, there are other diseases that emerge. So the reindeer get sick, but not from the CSIs, but because of climate and the other factors. And if we get more CSI, if we get more ticks on the coast, because the reindeer move to the coast, well, then they will also be impacted by the ticks there. So this is unsustainable practice in the long run by the pastoralists. They say this is not sustainable for our culture, not for reindeer herding, and not for the reindeer. They will get sick from this practice. So this was, I'm very proud of the linkages we eventually made, and I wish, like Gia, we had more time now to actually regroup and say, but then COVID hit, like we also talk about COVID. So I think that how we go about looking for the problem, this illustrates why the herders and the sheep farmers should be on board the project in the first place. But it wasn't possible to do that. But it does show how we get off onto the wrong track. So the take-home messages from us is what I just said, that the climate science, we need the climate science, obviously we need the climate science, and we could have started in that end and had some projections that we already knew about and talked to people. But the locally perceived climate risks are equally important, and how they interlink with the stressors. And this is important for how we define and frame our research. But it's the hen and the egg. Where do you start when we didn't know what the CSI, whether they actually existed when we started the project? And so here we have a situation where we have to look at the local challenges as well. Luckily, we knew a little bit about it, but not enough. And so when you co-produce knowledge for climate change adaptation, this is kind of what we've learned from this project and others, that when you do it right, it ideally breaks down the silos between the scientific and the indigenous knowledges or local knowledge. When you meet people around a fire or out there with the reindeer or somewhere, you talk to them, and you all bring what you know on equal terms, then the silos are sort of emptied from that we construct. And it also reveals the risk of adaptation being maladaptive and unsustainable in the long run. And I think we have several examples of this, that we create a condition, unintended consequences. co-production of knowledge, I argue, I don't know if I had a reindeer herder here, if he would say the same, but I hope so. It has mutual benefits. It deepens the scientific knowledge and alerts communities to emergent and relevant risks. And we have responses like that from the communities we worked in. But it also challenges us to be sensitive to epistemological differences, the forms that we know things or understand things. So I wanted to leave us with that take-home message, and I would love to hear your comments to this. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
And we are ready to, and I would like to welcome you to session 4, which has the focus on impacts of climate change, effects, and actions. We have 3 really interesting talks today with 4 speakers. So the focus is that we need to mitigate, we need to adapt, and we need to carry out fast and rapid transitions to low emission societies in face of the ongoing climate change. But climate change isn't just something that's happening now or will happen in the future. Climate change has been ongoing for almost 100 years, man-made climate change. And that long-term change is causing the effects of what we're seeing now. Rising sea level, thaw, permafrost, changing ecosystems, affecting us and affecting the livelihood on our planet. In this session, we'll get a state-of-the-art update on flooding and waters. I call this and melting of ice. It's like a story of ice and a story of rain and water that we'll get in this session. And our first speaker, she's been an Arctic researcher since 2002. She did her PhD in biology at University of Oslo in 2006. And she spent postdoc time both at the Norwegian Polar Institute and at AVI. And then she now works as a senior researcher at Akvaplan-niva in the Oslo office. And her overarching research interest is how algal communities in sea ice and in water is impacted by the ongoing climate change and how these changes affect the rest of the food webs. And that is also the theme of her talk today, and I'd like to welcome Eva Leu to give the talk of effects of sea ice decline on Arctic marine primary producers. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Kikki, and thanks for the invitation to give this talk here. So I invite you now to join me to the Arctic Ocean and have a look how the tremendous changes that we've been talking about now for more than a day affect organisms living up there. As we all know and are aware of, the climate warming happens much faster in the Arctic than in any other region of the globe. The latest status is that it happens 4 times faster than otherwise. As a consequence of this, one of the many consequences, we see that Arctic sea ice extent has been declining quite dramatically. And this is the curves we usually tend to see. However, I would argue that's an oversimplification. And I would like to make a case that until the year 2000, as was pointed out already yesterday, there was a rather stable, only slightly declining situation, while now the decline is actually really fast. And this tells us also something about that the changes we can wait to see not necessarily happen in a linear manner. And the latest models tell us that the summer sea ice in the Arctic might be gone already by the year 2035. That's 13 years from now. That's very soon. But what does it mean for the organisms living under the sea ice? Light availability will change if you remove the sea ice, obviously. You will also change the stratification of the water column because sea ice is fresher than the underlying water. So that means that the water column to some extent becomes more stable by having a salinity gradient. At the same time, however, you are removing the lid against wind-induced vertical mixing and also all the eddy formation that we could see yesterday. So those 2 effects are actually counteractive. And in coastal environments, if you remove the sea ice, you also get less physical stress on the very shallow waters that also has implications for primary producers living there. What is really important to keep in mind, though, is that all these changes take place in concert with other climate warming-induced environmental alterations, and therefore we have a very complex multi-stressor scenario. It is not only the sea ice extent, what we saw on this very well-known graph, that is changing, it's also the sea ice thickness that is decreasing. South of 70 degrees, we have almost no multi-year ice left, and in total there's very little multi-year ice left in the Arctic, and that is ice that has survived one summer, and also the snow depth is decreasing. Here is a contrast of first-year ice to multi-year ice in terms of how much of the incoming irradiance from the sun is reflected from those back into the atmosphere. And we see that multi-year ice tends to reflect much more back, and it's a summer ice situation, so you see melt ponds that are very dark, and obviously through these melt ponds and also leads, we will get much more of the warm irradiance into the water, and that is a process that speeds up and accelerates the warming in the Arctic even more. Now we dive into the water underneath the Arctic sea ice and look upwards like the diver here. And what we see there is an intricate landscape of darker and lighter spots if you look up towards the sea ice. And that's not a result of different ice thickness. This is a result of the snow cover on top of ice. So it's really the snow that is the wild card here, and that is super important to understand properly in order to see how much irradiance makes it to the water. I'm an algae researcher, so I'm very interested in what the algae do. And they have their superpower is photosynthesis. So they are the only organisms in the sea that are capable of using inorganic carbon, CO2 and water to make glucose, organic carbon out of it. And by this, they form the basis of the food web. They also, of course, need to do other metabolites. They don't only consist of glucose. And for doing so, they need a number of nutrients. And so if we talk about how environmental changes affect primary producers that can do photosynthesis, we are talking mainly about the availability of light and nutrients that is changing. If you talk about Arctic marine primary producers, they come actually in very different versions. So up to the left, we see phytoplankton. This is unicellular algae that we find in the water column in all oceans of the world. Also unicellular algae in the next picture can form huge strands at the underside of sea ice. This is in the middle picture. And we also find similarly unicellular algae inside the sea ice, in the most concentrated in the bottom layer. But we also have algae living on the sea floor, as the lower pictures show. And there again, we have both unicellular, but also big algae, like the seaweeds you see on the last picture. And it's clear that since they are so different, they will not be affected in the same way, right? So this is a topography of the Arctic Ocean. And as you can see, the Arctic Ocean is very shallow, or large parts of it are very shallow. 53% of the area are occupied by shelf seas, and the deep Arctic Ocean accounts for a little bit less than half of it. However, the productivity in the system takes place on these shelf seas. That's very important to keep in mind. I will now focus on two of these groups that I introduced to you, the phytoplankton, that's you are seeing here, very beautiful, making long strains, some of them at least. These are mainly diatoms, and ice algae. These two communities are usually rather distinct, so we have different species. And in the ice algae, what is important to add there is they often tend to form big colonies, and when they're coming out of the sea ice at the end of their growing season, they tend to form big aggregates that sink relatively fast to the seafloor. This is a picture of the seasonality in the system. So we start out in winter. This is a very empty picture in the winter. That's not the entire truth. There's actually a whole lot of things going on in wintertime, but now we think about photosynthesis. So obviously in the polar night, there's not enough light for fueling photosynthesis. So the whole system is what we call net heterotrophic. There can't be any photoautotroph production. By the time the sun returns after the polar night, we start seeing first algae blooms, and usually they occur at the bottom of the sea ice because that's the safest place to be. It's closest to the incoming sun. They have access to nutrients from the underlying water, and they start growing there. During this phase, they are utilized only by very specialized grazers. So some copepods can do that, some amphipods, and also tiny protists living inside the sea ice. But that's a very limited system still. When the season then progresses further and it becomes warmer, a physical transformation of the sea ice happens. So both the snow on top is melting, We find melt ponds, but also the ice structure as such is changing. And in this phase, number 3, you see that sea ice algae start being sloughed off the sea ice, and some of them make it all the way to the seafloor, where they represent a really important source of food for the seafloor communities. By the time the sea ice becomes more transparent, you also will find primary production of phytoplankton going on underneath sea ice. So they don't have to wait for open waters. They only have to wait until the sea ice is transparent enough. So you first have the ice algae bloom and then the phytoplankton bloom. When we try to understand the productivity of the future Arctic marine system, this balance between these two types of primary producers is really a key question that we need to get a better handle on. Because they differ in the timing of their blooms, ice algae being earlier, and they also differ functionally since they are different type of grazers that can utilize them. So that has obviously consequences for biogeochemical cycling, and we therefore need to understand how they will react towards the future environmental changes they're going to face. For 5 years, from 2015 to 20, I was leading a project called Fabulous, standing for future Arctic algae blooms and their role in the context of climate change. And that was one of the key questions that we tried to address here. So we were asking, what is the difference in the capacity of ice algae and phytoplankton to fix carbon by photosynthesis along a light gradient? We did fieldwork in Van Meinfjorden in Svalbard in 2017, and you see a picture here from a ROV taken from underneath the ice, and you see the whole underside of the ice was brown due to a diatom ice algae bloom, but also the underlying water was really green due to a phytoplankton bloom. So contrary to what I just explained to you, we now see when the ice is thin that sometimes these blooms are almost co-occurring. And we took advantage of that situation and sampled both communities. We put them into flasks of different gray shades, spiked them with radioactive carbon to measure the uptake of this carbon through photosynthesis, and incubated them under sea ice for 24 hours to measure their uptake. And what we found was really a striking difference between these two different communities, although they were sampled very close together. So the red lines in these graphs are the phytoplankton, the pelagic ones. The blue graphs is ice algae. And you see at the x-axis, we are talking about increasing irradiances. And then we have in the left panel the carbon uptake, and in the right panel the electron transport rate. And in both cases, both of them start increasing with increasing light, logically, as you would expect. But then the ice algae level off much earlier, meaning that if you increase the light even further, they are not able to utilize this. So they don't produce more biomass, because for them it's simply too much, they can't take it. That's a very important difference. We then went one step further and looked more into specifically a stress response setting. And this was a combination of the effect of ocean acidification, which also is a very big problem in the Arctic, and again, light stress. So we picked representatives, one for phytoplankton, Thalassosira hyalina, and one ice algae, Nichia frigida, both being diatoms, and cultivated them identically for 1 month under moderate light and at 2 different PCO2 concentrations to simulate ocean acidification. After that time, we exposed them for a rapid light shock, increased the light by 10-fold. That is something that can easily happen if you have rainfall on snow, for example, on the ice, or if the ice breaks up. And then we were following the response in terms of photophysiology, pigment composition, growth, size, and gene expression. And what we found, at least in the phytoplankton, there were 3 different response phases. So Thalassosira first initially had a moderate decrease of their fitness, which is indicated by the uppermost panel, but kept some level, and then crashed after 24 hours, only then to recover and acclimate to the new conditions they were experiencing. And the lower 2 panels showing growth rate and POC production per cell show that also under the higher light condition, Thalassosira was actually able to produce more carbon per cell than it was at the initial conditions. For Nichia, the blue line, that looks completely different. So the ice algae basically crashed instantaneously in its fitness, and then it stayed low. Until 72 hours, there was no sign of recovery whatsoever, Towards the end, you can argue there's maybe a slight increase, but it's really a very, very different reaction. And you have to consider they have been treated exactly the same the month before we started this experiment. So it's really an inherent difference in them. So if you take a step back, having learned all this, what will future Arctic algae blooms look like? This is again trying to summarize the seasonal progression and also showing all the multiple processes affecting them. And we can say that ice algae seem to be much less tolerant to the future conditions as far as we understood. So they might be the losers in this game here. We expect ice algae and pelagic blooms to occur closer to each other in time. The under-ice phytoplankton blooms will be more widespread. As I explained, when the ice becomes more transparent, more of the annual production is already going on underneath the ice, which has implications for the detectability by remote sensing. For example, you don't see this on satellites. And also that might lead to the fact that by the time the ice breaks up, the surface layer is already depleted for nitrate or nutrients, and then the chlorophyll actually goes deeper, which again makes it elusive to remote sensing. Why does this matter for people who are not algae enthusiasts as I am? As I tried to say already, ice algae and phytoplankton represent the basis of the food web, as photosynthetic organisms are the only ones that are capable of producing biomass from scratch, so to speak. And in specialized Arctic food webs, we have actually only rather few organism groups that are channeling this produced biomass to higher trophic levels. A key role plays here the zooplankton, that's small crustaceans grazing on these algae. And then also the polar cod, a very specialized fish that is also in some life stages closely associated with the ice, plays a big role here. And I want to introduce to you this link between primary producers and their key grazers. We find in mesozooplankton 3 species of colonists, Colonus tuberculeus, glacialis, and Fimarchicus, being very different in size and lipid content. And I talk about the middle one here, Colonus glacialis. They have a seasonal life cycle. That means they're coming up in spring, close to the sea ice. The females are feeding on the ice algae bloom, fueling the egg production. And by the time the offspring has reached their first feeding stage, they can take advantage of phytoplankton. So that's in a best way the match scenario you see on top, and that leads to a high population biomass recruitment. If we now have this future scenario with a shorter bloom, overlapping bloom, then the offspring might not even reach any phytoplankton, but come to the surface when the phytoplankton bloom is more or less gone. So that has consequences, obviously, for the ecosystem. If you take this one step further, there was a very nice study in 2020 about the Bering Sea ecosystem. There we had a system very shallow that was characterized by a high productive benthic community, so sea bottom community. And they saw a tremendous decrease in sea ice cover, an increase in sea bottom temperatures, and as a consequence of that, a decrease in Colonus glacialis, the guy I just introduced, the zooplankton, a very heavy decrease within a few years only of epibenthic biomass, and at the same time, juvenile pink salmon increased. So it's really the whole system is changing. And for other reasons, more due to Atlantification, we see similar transitions in the Barents Sea as well. So we see an increase in summer water temperature of the Atlantic water, a decrease in sea ice coverage, earlier spring bloom, an increase in the smallest of these 3 copepods, which has much less energy per individuum. And the lower 2 panels show you the dramatic changes we see in the fish populations where Atlantic species take over for Arctic species. In the central Arctic Ocean, we don't have this comprehensive picture in place yet, so just a few words about it. The summer sea ice will be gone by 2050, I would say at the latest, maybe even before. The obligatory ice-associated species will obviously be lost unless they find a way to survive not in the ice. When it comes to the increase in production, this will be limited by nutrients. And the Arctic Ocean is very nutrient poor, and how much nutrients will be there depends really on all these physical processes that are complex to understand. We will still have winter sea ice, but the associated ecosystem will differ. So to sum up, we see a decline of Arctic sea ice that has far-reaching implications for physicochemical conditions in the system. And those again affect the primary producers since they are reliant on these physicochemical conditions in order to be successful. But not all the groups are affected in the same way or equally strong. Ice algae seem to be particularly vulnerable. Changes in their relative contribution to the overall production has far-reaching implications for the ecosystem at large, and we see presumably a weaker coupling from this production to the benthos. The overall increase in production in the Central Arctic Ocean will be limited by nutrients, but we are to date still lacking in understanding fully of the processes that will regulate these nutrient stocks in the Arctic Ocean. And something I didn't have time to talk about, but the upscaling of these productivity changes on a pan-Arctic scale is really still challenging. And it's also important to keep in mind that we actually don't have a proper baseline here. So all the publications about how much the production is going to increase or has increased are, to my extent, to my knowledge, a little bit biased by the fact that no one actually knows what was the production before. Because looking underneath the sea ice is actually a difficult thing to do, especially on large scales. So with this, I only want to point out some ongoing research I'm involved in, the Sudaku project dealing with the sustainable development of the Arctic Ocean, also very interdisciplinary, funded by the Fram Center and taking place in Tromsø. And then at Akvaplan-niva, we have a polar front project where we study the ecosystem at the polar front in the Barents Sea. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Senior Lecturer Gustaf Hugelius from the Department of Physical Geography here at the Stockholm University. He's also the Vice Rector of the Bolin Center for Climate Research and co-leads the research unit on landscape, environment, and geomatics. The main focus for Gustaf's research is soils. Soils are cool. They play a role in the global carbon system. Just come down here, Gustaf. And particularly, you're interested in the role of soils, bogs, and frozen land in terms of its role in the global carbon cycle. And that's exactly what you're going to talk about today. Permafrost troughs, impacts to northern ecosystems and communities. Welcome, Gustaf. Give Gustaf a good clap.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come and talk to you about permafrost thaw impacts to northern ecosystems and communities. And permafrost systems also exist in the subsea systems, but I'm going to stay on land, so really focus on the terrestrial permafrost ecosystems. So we've already heard a little bit talk about permafrost. I'm going to focus mainly on the sort of climate aspects and the biochemical impacts, but also talk a little bit about, of course, impact to infrastructure, etc. Global warming thaws permafrost, and permafrost it's sometimes referred to as one of sort of the sleeping giants of the global climate system. Permafrost covers really large areas, especially in the northern hemisphere, roughly 15 million square kilometers. It's almost three times the size of the EU, and it holds a lot of carbon that has been accumulated over thousands and thousands of years. And as this starts to thaw, it becomes available for decomposition by microbes, releasing greenhouse gases, mainly CO2 and methane, but also nitrous oxides can be an important contributor. I like this image because it gives a sense of the scale of the problem, at least if we look over long time scales. And you actually have a professor from the Alfred Wegener Institute there for scale. So you also get the humans in the picture. This particular image is from a coastal thaw slump on the Canadian Beaufort Sea coast, and it's about 30 or 40 meters high. So it's a dramatic landform. Most permafrost thaw is not this visually dramatic, but still it's a good analogy for the scale of the problem. And because global warming is a positive, there's a positive feedback, you also, further increase the other permafrost impacts that we've already talked about of infrastructure and human activities, but also impacts to ecosystems, to biodiversity, and to the structure of the ecosystems as we know them. But the main reason that permafrost thaw has gotten so much research attention, I would say particularly in the past 15 years, this research field has really exploded, is because of the size of the permafrost carbon pool. This is, I think, a nice figure from a recent FAO report that summarizes roughly the sizes of the active carbon pools in the global climate system. You have the atmosphere on top, approaching 900 gigatons. All living vegetation on Earth is a little bit more than 500 gigatons. And then you have the biggest reactive carbon pool, which is the soils, more than 3,000 petagrams or gigatons. And roughly half of this is actually in the permafrost region. Even if it only covers quite a small fraction of all of the soil surfaces, it has this disproportionately large storage of carbon. And this is because it's been accumulating for thousands and thousands of years, and because of the frozen conditions, often waterlogged conditions in wetlands, peatlands, it has accumulated. And of course, then the concern is that over time, part of this carbon storage will be remobilized and enter the atmosphere. There are no projections that suggest that all of this carbon will come into the atmosphere in any reasonable time scale. So we're not talking about 1,500 petagrams of carbon entering the atmosphere, but a fraction of it might. And that is what we're concerned about. Permafrost has been, of course, part of several, been included in several IPCC cycles. This graph illustrates, sort of summarizes the findings from the most recent IPCC chapter 5 in the AR6, or in the Working Group 1 report of AR6. I think that this IPCC report did a really good job of including the permafrost to the extent possible. They had the limitation that the permafrost is not included in the Earth system models that went into the CMIP6 model into comparison, but they still did a good job of synthesizing existing science, and they came up with a number here of between 14 and 200 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. So now we've changed the unit. So now we're talking about CO2, not just carbon, and we're talking about CO2 equivalents, which means that we've lumped methane and CO2 together, using a 100-year conversion factor for methane. And if we plot this out in relation to global warming, you see for 3 different global warming scenarios on the x-axis, 1.5, 2, and 4. Oh, can I move this? Down here.
You have to point on the screen.
Yeah, I have to point there, but it doesn't end up where I'm pointing, I think. But anyway, I'll stop using it. So you have 1.5, 2 degree, and 4 degree scenarios, and in this case, it assumes that the warming will be capped and stabilized at 2100. And then you see the projected emissions in gigatons of CO2 equivalents. Roughly 200, or slightly less than 200 petagrams, 1.5, and then increasing sharply. On the right-hand side, up there, you see the total remaining emission budget for to stay under 1.5 degrees. So you see that permafrost actually, in theory, eats up a large chunk of that budget, which is alarming. But one thing to consider is there's the time mismatch. The budget we're talking about to stay below 1.5 degrees, that is what we're going to do in the coming 10 years. The permafrost is going to be emitting this carbon for the coming 100 or hundreds of years. So the permafrost carbon is never going to come into the atmosphere fast enough to close that window for us, because that is happening sooner. But still, it's good to get a sense of the relative numbers. So this is what the IPCC projected based on sort of a synthesis of a lot of different studies. The unfortunate thing with this is that while they did look at all of the studies, they were very conservative when it came to a particular type of thaw, which we often call abrupt thaw, which is basically a local scale tipping point where you have a lot of massive ice in the ground that can melt, and as it drains away, the ground surface will start to subside and collapse. So you see an example from the Colima River. They're pondering the sort of upper edge of an ice wedge there in the first photograph. And this ice wedge, this one is probably, it's about 10 meters wide and probably about 30 meters deep. So and in a lot of these areas, more than 50%, as much as 90% of the volume of the ground is pure ice. So when that disappears, you go from having a stable tundra to a lake or something else. And over time, this ground subsidence leads to surface collapse, and you get a completely new ecosystem. On the bottom right corner there, you see some permafrost type that is typical for Fennoscandia. It's a Paulsamire, a permafrost peatland that is thawing, and it's becoming a wet fen or a lake instead. And now if you include all of the emissions that we think come from these different types of abrupt thaw or thermokarst landforms, they are on par with all of the other permafrost thaw happening. So it might, so if we include this, especially the methane coming out, it almost doubles the total feedback from the permafrost system. These graphs are from a very nice synthesis paper led by Merit Turetsky. That is really the first, very simple, but still first modeling attempt to get all of these together in one. So the numbers that we're presenting now is based on that particular paper, which is a big synthesis study that we collected. So if you add these abrupt thaw numbers on top of the IPCC numbers, the picture becomes a little bit more dire. So you see, especially at 4 degrees, you get a pretty large increase there because we project a large acceleration of these abrupt thaw events under rapid warming scenarios. Another sort of potentially complicating factor when it comes to permafrost systems, and I think any Earth systems sort of that has threshold type behavior or irreversible type behavior, is if we're starting to think about overshoot warming trajectories. And given how the conversations are going probably right now at COP27, I think overshoot warming realities are becoming more and more likely. And this is essentially when you have a future scenario where we will go past our target temperature, relying on negative emission technologies to pull the temperature back down later on, as in the red curve, as opposed to just rapidly reducing emissions and just hitting the target and not going over it. The problem is if you add these feedbacks that are not in the climate models, first of all, the first problem is that you overshoot even more, and that is also true for the green curve, it will also go over. But the second problem is, if you look at these sort of shaded areas, is that you have this irreversible permafrost loss that is not going to refreeze, that is going to keep emitting, and that is going to make the problem worse for a very long time. So if you have a model rendition of this and you add overshoot on top of the 1.5 or 2 degree warming scenarios, you get also significantly added emissions. So this all adds up to a sort of dire picture for future emissions from thawing permafrost. Now this sort of, I think I will come back to the emissions at the end, but also we're talking about all of the other impacts of permafrost thaw to the ecosystems, to the infrastructure. We talked a lot about the infrastructure, so I'm not going to stay too long on that, but I'll just give some overarching thoughts or sort of evidence. In general, this is just a Google image search that I did last week, permafrost and infrastructure, and these are some of the images that come up. It's something that is happening all over the Arctic. In some places it comes as a surprise, in other places it's been planned for by managers for a really long time. It's also important to note that there's a huge community of permafrost engineers that know how to build on permafrost, and a lot of the infrastructure in the Arctic is, to the extent possible, really adapted to being on permafrost. They have cooling siphons, and there are engineering ways of reducing the thaw of permafrost. So you could actually see a road that is properly built or a pipeline will actually, to some extent, protect the permafrost through engineering solutions and will probably stay longer than the ground around it. But still, at some point, even that is likely going to thaw. Here I'm showing a map that's taken from a recent really nice review paper on this by Jan Hjort, where they conclude that by the middle of this century, thaw hazard will in some way affect roughly 4 million people, slightly different number from what we heard earlier, and between 30 and 50% of critical Arctic infrastructure. Costs with increased cost ranging in the tens of billions of dollars. So no fixed number there, but and you also see how this hazard is unevenly distributed across the Arctic. And this is mainly the main driver behind the hazard is actually, or the variation in the hazard that we see, is the properties of the permafrost itself. How much ice is in the ground, how likely is this permafrost to be affected, combined with the warming rate, of course. So the actual permafrost properties themselves are accounted for in the studies by the researchers working on it. So I just want to show as well that they go into some details about what type of infrastructure is under threat. You see, particularly railways, you have a really high percentage of high hazard as well. One thing that I thought might be interesting for the context of this discussions or the later discussions is that there's a lot of oil and gas or hydrocarbon extraction infrastructure on permafrost. There's a thaw risk for about 45% of the Russian hydrocarbon extraction by 2050. And I've noted there has been a shift in how the Russian government talks about permafrost. From the narrative has been in the past that it's just positive, but there's also a growing realization that as things get warmer, the infrastructure that's on permafrost now will be destroyed before it makes it easier to rebuild it again. So there is, I think, also an awareness and a concern about this to a large extent in the Russian community and societies. This is also work by Jan Hjort. And yet another area, the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau, a recent study concluding that permafrost thaw will add infrastructure costs on around $6 billion by 2090. And I think one of the key sort of risks here is to the high-speed railway between Lanzhou and Lhasa. But of course, permafrost also exists in other areas, and I think this, sometimes called the third pole, is also an area of great geopolitical interest. So I talked now a little bit about climate, about infrastructure. I also want to get a little bit into damages to ecosystems in general. So the changes that we see to the landscape, it doesn't just affect the radiative or the greenhouse gas balance, it also affects the landforms themselves, which are associated with biodiversity or geodiversity, different plant and animal types that are adapted to living on and in permafrost. And this is one excerpt from a nice paper looking at the future sort of conditions for some of these different landforms. This is a map of ice wedge polygon tundra, and the orange and red is where you find them now, and blue is where they might start appear, or where they might be under RCP 4.5 at the end of the century. So we see a really dramatic decrease in the extent of ice wedge polygons. And when you think of a tundra ecosystem, these polygons are really, you very often see them, they're really important part of the lowland tundra ecosystem. They are fundamental for the hydrology of the system and control a lot of different aspects of how these ecosystems function. Another type of landform that is being lost quite rapidly, that I was already mentioning, is common to Scandinavia, is Paulsamires, or permafrost wetlands and peatlands. In this photograph, you see a Paulsa from northern Fennoscandia. You see an aerial photograph of what it typically looks like from above. There are these mosaics of different wetlands and peatland types. And these are really associated to a lot, these are important habitats for a lot of migrating birds. They are important for reindeer. They have there's a lot of biodiversity and other values associated with these landforms. But they're also projected to be more or less disappear. You see the remaining projected areas of Paulsa peatlands 2060 to 2080 in this image, and they are basically gone from Fennoscandia. So this is also quite great concern for other reasons, including biodiversity. I should mention that this is from work that's actually in review still, but from the cryosphere discussions. Also a very nice paper. And this aspect of sort of threat to wetlands and peatlands is something that was lifted up or is hopefully going to be lifted up again in a project in the Arctic Council, in the CAF working group, so the conversation of Arctic flora and fauna. And there's a Swedish-led project there called Resilience and Management of Arctic Wetlands, where the first phase ended at the last ministerial meeting in Reykjavik in 2021, and we were supposed to start the second phase, but Arctic Council work has been frozen due to the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. As you know, Russia is still chair of the Arctic Council, and we might see this project starting up again as the chairmanship transitions to Norway. We'll see how that works. But there's this project produced a lot of reports focusing on Arctic wetlands and peatlands, and there's a lot of good material there for infrastructure and management of landscapes in general. Because in the end, in this project, I was lead for the final part of it. We took a quite broad view of wetlands that include a lot of wet tundra and coastal systems, etc., in the definitions as well. And at the ministerial, there were a set of key findings and policy recommendations that were adopted and accepted by the foreign ministers of the Arctic countries, and I'm just going to highlight a few of them. Key finding is that widespread climate impacts in Arctic wetlands are ongoing and projected to increase, and then there was a policy recommendation then to encourage Arctic cooperation to amplify efforts to reduce fossil fuel emissions inside and outside the Arctic. So there's a range of policy recommendation there that can be used, I think, also to motivate action, and that's what we're hoping to do in the next phase of this project, actually, to work with individual countries or nations to follow up to the recommendations. Another finding and recommendation that I want to touch on is that indigenous people's knowledge and stewardship is important for successful management of Arctic wetlands and ecosystems in general. Was another key finding of this report. And there is a policy recommendation at the national level then that wetland policy should recognize the legacy and future importance of indigenous people's stewardship and the need for collaborative integrated management of Arctic wetlands. And I just want to highlight one of the reports that came out earlier in the study, which was done by an indigenous researcher called Victoria Bushman, where she did a synthesis on looking at Arctic wetlands and indigenous peoples. I know that you shouldn't put tables into presentations, but I sort of did anyway. And I just want to show here that indigenous use of the surveyed wetlands is occurring in more than 80% of the wetlands that have been surveyed. And this ranges from food collection to reindeer herding to a lot of different things. But it's just also, I think we've already talked about this, but it amplifies, you know, this view that we can't think of these ecosystems as being completely untouched, and that we have to integrate all of these different aspects. So now, sort of finishing up, I'm going back to the IPCC report, and this is a section that I thought was quite nice. It's in the frequently asked questions section of the last IPCC report, and they ask, could climate change be reversed by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? That's the scenario that they're thinking about here. And then the question is, yes, it can, but there will be, if we're looking at the global surface temperature, there's a lag of a few years, and then it can be reversed. If you're looking at other aspects of the ecosystems, the answer, they still say, yes, it can, but the lag is decades. I would actually say that centuries is more suitable for permafrost rather than decades, but still, they say that it's reversible. While yet other aspects of the Earth system is that no, you can't, or at least not over century or millennia, like ocean thermal expansion. So this is also something that's important to keep in mind, that some of these responses are really long-term. And I think if we go back to the picture we had of permafrost, okay, it's slightly reversible, but you still have this very substantial loss. And that is not going to refreeze anytime soon. Once the ground ice disappears, it's, you know, local feedback kick in, and that permafrost will actually keep emitting greenhouse gases for several hundred years. So this shows an example of, you know, you've seen the numbers for 2100 earlier, but if we add 2300, the long-term perspective, even if we cap warming by 2100, the emissions will keep growing. And you see, especially in the 4-degree scenario, you have really, really large substantial emissions happening all the way out to 2300, which means that we are essentially committing 5, 6, 7, 10 future generations to have to keep using negative emissions to offset this. Otherwise, the climate is not going to be stable. So we're really tying many, many future generations to have to deal with this problem that we're causing now. So just to summarize, we are already committed to really profound permafrost impacts to ecosystems, climate, and communities. Then, depending on what we do, they will be at a different order of magnitude. It reduces the remaining CO2 budget with strong effects projected by the end of this century, not in the coming decades necessarily. And the models used by IPCC are 6. They do lack important long-term feedbacks, including permafrost, also wetlands and fires, as they pointed out themselves in the summary for policymakers in a good way. Abrupt thought processes are really important. They create local scale tipping points that transform ecosystems, damage infrastructure, and greatly increase warming. To a large extent with methane emissions, but also actually increased CO2 emissions. Overshoot warming would trigger irreversible permafrost thaw that would drive additional warming for a century, even after the climate stabilizes. So we can also note that global warming is reversible, but a lot of feedbacks will persist for centuries to millennia. So there's also a need to keep the long-term perspective in mind. Thank you.
From ice and frost, we're going to move on to a subject that's very close to my heart, because it's not just getting warmer and wilder, but it's also getting wetter. And we will have 2 presenters, Colin Baquet, who is a senior research fellow and team leader of the Water Coast and Ocean Group of Stockholm Environmental Institute. But the first speaker is Magnus Hieronymus, who works at the Swedish Meteorological and Hydrological Institute. So you're a research leader for ocean climate and a member of the expert group on sea level rise, with research focused on sea level and the role of the ocean in the climate systems. Combined, you will give us a presentation of the multiple hydrometeorological hazards and critical what's critical to infrastructures, right? So, yeah. So yeah, sorry. Thank you. So you'll swap places with Karina in a little.
Yeah.
Now we give a little applause for that.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity, and so I will start. I will be kind of the natural science part of this talk, and then Karina, who is more versatile, will cover everything else. So the hydrohazard project. Those of us working in it is the Stockholm Environment Institute, it's SMHI, Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and it is financed by the Civil Contingency Agency, MSB, and the Research Council for Sustainable Development, FORMAS. And we will try to answer different questions like what risks might cascade from multiple hydrometeorological hazards in Sweden? And how will climate change affect or alter the risk of disastrous domino effects? And what implications are there for infrastructures and for different social groups? And what measures are needed to reduce vulnerabilities? So the part that I have been mostly involved in, the kind of different hazards or the natural science part, I've done together with a lot of people, but mostly with Peter Berg and Wei Yang, who are hydrologists at SMHI, and I'm from the oceanography group. And I'll start with a borrowed scheme from a recent assessment report from the Baltic Sea, and you don't have to assimilate all of this here. But the point I'm trying to make, and I will also struggle with this pointer, I see, is that some hazards go together. And it can start with large-scale climate variability. So in the top of this winter figure here, we have the NAO plus and the NAO, the North Atlantic Oscillation is a climate mode. That's positive and negative phase. If it's in the more positive phase, you have more cyclones, which gives you storm surges, so high sea levels. It also gives you increased precipitation, which gives you higher river floods. It gives you more flooding directly from precipitation. It also gives you destruction of property. So it kind of seems a single driver gives you multiple hazards, and that can be quite common. But these hazards, some of them also have trends. On the left figure here, we have almost hopeless to the point, but it's trends in river discharge, and blue here is positive. And these are quite, there's a, let's say, rich spatial pattern in these trends, and they are probably driven to a large degree by climate variability. And our focus area in this has been Sweden, and we see that we have an increasing runoff trend in the west, on the west coast of Sweden, most other part, but the trends are relatively weak. In the right figure, we have the sea level rise. The arrows show trends. Here, blue is a negative trend, and red is a positive trend, rising sea levels. And the colors, they show the sea level change in a very high emission scenario between, well, basically now and the end of the century. What we can see is that in Sweden, there's quite a sharp transition from where the sea rises in the south to where it falls in the north, and this is an effect of post-glacial rebound. So you have a lot of land rise in the northern parts of Sweden, and it maxes out at about 1 centimeter per year, and in the southernmost tip of Sweden it's almost zero. But that gives you a lot of different conditions. Some parts the flooding hazard is going down, and in other parts it's going up, just from this. So why do we care about it then? This is it's a lot of hypothetical probability density functions. And they are meant to demonstrate the effects of climate change. So in gray here, we have a 2D figure. We have two different axes. We can imagine that the x-axis is, for example, river stream flow, and the y-axis can be sea level. The level curves, they are events of equal probability, and you have gray ones for a before state and red ones for a perturbed state, such as climate change, for example. And the first one, we have a shift in the mean, so this could be your mean sea level rise, for example. And then you have a thick dashed line that shows you events that were problematic in the unperturbed state. So this, I said these lines are lines of equal probability, but all events having equal probability don't have equal impact. So you can have rare events that doesn't matter, or you can have rare events that matter a lot. And that's, many times that's the tricky thing here. And what you see is when you shift the mean, you get both more of these troublesome events, but you also get kind of new events that didn't even occur in the unperturbed system. But for hazards to go together, they must have a seasonality that is similar. So here we have plotted a 100-year return level for different months, and this is for sea level. And a 100-year return level is it's a level of the sea level you expect to see only once in a century. And you can see that you have high return levels in winter and very low return levels in summer. So extreme sea levels occur in winter, basically. These similar figures for, on the left you have precipitation, and on the right you have stream flow. Well, you can see that precipitation, high precipitation is mostly a summer thing. High stream flows, this is the spring flood. It occurs typically a little bit later in the year than what we expect the extreme sea levels. But there are areas like on the west coast, again, where we typically have high stream flows in winter and together with high sea levels. So this leads us to our kind of favorite hazard here, compound coastal flooding. So you have low pressure system, they dump a lot of precipitation, they raise the sea, it gives you flooding. So the figure here shows the correlation. You can forget about everything but the blue dots here. That's what normal people call the correlation coefficient. The others are also other kinds of correlation coefficients, but and it's for different. It's a long time series. It's climate modeling data, some 500 years of data. And we extract the maxima of river stream flow and sea levels for every month, and then we'll look at the correlations. And we find that these individual years are strongly correlated in certain months, and other months they are not. So they are strongly correlated in winter months, basically, because they have a common forcer, which is they all depend on the NAO and cyclones coming in. And this is, well, it's basically the same, but it's for the mean sea level. I filter a bit, and I find that the yearly mean sea level and the yearly mean river discharge are also strongly correlated. So this leads us to my conclusions. In most parts of Sweden, the spring flood occurs later than the most extreme sea levels. So does the precipitation, but the west coast is a bit specific here. Here is the risk of having a high stream flow and a river flow is much larger. Having a joint sea level and stream flow is much larger. And climate change effects, they will compound, in particular for sea level, because the mean has a very strong effect on the frequency of flooding. And what's behind this covariability is large-scale climate variability. Both the river stream flow and the sea levels are correlated, for example, to the NAO. And by that, I will leave to Helena.
I just wanted to give Karina Baquet a proper introduction, because from the knowledge of increasing hazard and compound events comes the need and knowledge to explore mechanisms for how we could connect the landscape and governance of the landscape and infrastructure diversification as a way to increase the resilience in society and also inform society. And this is the heart of Karina's research. She's the leader of the Water, Coast and Ocean Group at the Stockholm Environment Institute. So this would be really interesting to follow up from the weather hazard to how we deal with it. Welcome.
Thank you. So I'm going to be shifting a little bit the area. So from what Magnus presented, what we basically did was to zoom into the area that presented the risk of compound hazards, which is on the west coast. That's not really the Arctic, unless you ask somebody based in the equator, they might clump everything up north. But I think that some of the methods and the approaches that I'll be talking about today might be relevant regardless of the geography that we're speaking about. So what we did was to understand the impacts that these compound events would have on society. We looked at impacts on infrastructures, specifically critical infrastructures, and then the impacts that this would have on society. So what we did was to extract basically infrastructure data, which nowadays is not necessarily easily available. At the time we were gathering data, there was an invasion in a pretty close country that we discussed about. So handing out data on critical infrastructures wasn't necessarily easy. Thankfully, we have OpenStreetMaps, which has a lot of data, a bit scary, available for everyone. But so from OpenStreetMaps, we generated infrastructure interdependencies, which is what we are interested in here. We're not looking at the individual infrastructures like water, electricity, but we're looking at the connections between them to understand the effects that this may have. When one fails, what happens with the next, basically. So based on this, we created layers of infrastructure interdependencies, focusing on 5 sectors that you can see in this slide. And using these layers of infrastructures, we explored the vulnerability, or the other end of the coin, the resilience of infrastructure networks, by exploring specifically 2 aspects, criticality and vulnerability. So criticality is basically the number of infrastructures depending on that node, and this node is a connection between different infrastructures. How many others are relying on that node? And vulnerability is the number of infrastructures providing services to that node. So how reliant are these nodes to other infrastructures? Examples are, for example, wastewater treatment plants are depending on energy, so they might be vulnerable, and households are highly dependent on everything, really. And so these are the list of critical and vulnerable nodes. So we've got communication towers, which are quite critical, water and wastewater treatment plants, power plants and substations. And on the vulnerable node side, we have residential areas, industrial areas, healthcare, public administration facilities, etc. We then looked at how many of these, the over 6,000, I think, nodes of infrastructures or infrastructures that we downloaded, how many end up below the water in some sense, whether because of river floods or because of coastal floods or because of precipitation. And what we find is that about 400 of these nodes end up in one way or another below water to some extent, but we only find that few of them are super critical, and I will get back to that. To understand how the cascading effects, so now we saw how many of them end up below water, but how are these affecting critical service provision? When will you be able to have electricity, or for how long will you lose out electricity if there's an impairment in the infrastructure? For this, we carried out a disruption analysis, which tells us 2 things. One is how affected neighbors can cause uncontained failure propagation. And the second is to what extent can we expect a reduction in network performance if nodes are removed. Let's say if a node is not working out, then you assume that the node is gone, then what happens with the rest of the infrastructures? And you can see here examples, or let's say some of the most critical ones, some of the most affected ones. And what we see is that it's only 1.3% of the nodes of all these 6,000 that we downloaded initially that are significantly more disruptive than others. Then we wanted to understand who is going to be affected by this. And in order to understand this, we first needed to assess who is vulnerable to begin with. And a vulnerability assessment, social vulnerability assessment in Sweden did not exist. So we had to do one, and the methodology that we employed was actually very much inspired by my former supervisor and his group at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, Jan Kettelrud. So the Norwegian ties continue even though we're not in the Arctic. And in a combination of literature reviews and bottom-up and a co-creation approach with our stakeholders, we selected the variables that define social vulnerability in the Swedish case. Just one interesting thing here is gender is not included as most social vulnerability indices would show in the rest of the world. And I will get to that soon. In order to understand which factors played out and how they played out, we use a factor analysis, which seems to be, according to my colleagues, seems to be the way to go when it comes to vulnerability indices. And this means that we group different types of indicators to create 3 factors. The factor analysis resulted or gave us an answer that 3 factors are the ones that play a role. Afterwards, their importance drops. And you can see the 3 important factors here. So household owners with children, which integrate indicators related to income, age, single family houses, average number of cars, and percentage of children living at home. We have another factor related to the labor force and whether you have employment. It's quite related to your origin, whether you're foreign-born, educational attainment, and how long you've been unemployed, but also number of sick leave days. And then we have a third factor related to age and wealth, which is number of households with an income above, which is 200% over the national median. It's also an age factor and the average living space per person. The fourth factor here, which was in the slide, was exposure. So we treat exposure to hydroclimatic events as a separate factor. And our results for Halmstad municipality in the west coast is that we see a particular area called Östra Stranden being especially vulnerable if we take into account these 4 factors. And the images, you can see highest is red, lowest is blue, which is slightly different use of colors than Magnus used before. So red is bad, blue is good in this case. We can also see some images of how some of these areas look. So if you look at Frösakul, this is an area which is, despite its proximity to the coastal area, and in some of the previous results, they showed some sort of potential vulnerability because of the age of the groups and the wealth of the people living there. They're generally quite well off. They're in the blue part. And if you look at how the place looks compared to Andersberg, which is in one of the redder zones, it's quite telling of how the characteristics of the population. So in Andersberg you have higher unemployment, people with language barriers, lower income. Wealth, I think the picture in Frösakul speaks for itself. This is some other images of other areas. Östra Stranden is a beach, but it's also an area where you have cottages, and it's one of the most exposed areas, of course, so then it ranks high in the social vulnerability index. And these are just some examples of the floods experienced in the area, both from the river Nissen that is crossing the municipality, as well as from Storm and Gorm, and this is a picture from the coast. So we are, of course, very happy with and interested in these results, but we're also aware that results on projects are time fixed, they're time bound, and in a year time from now they're old. So what we wanted to do was to leave something that the municipality, which is our end user, could replicator could just follow up beyond the project's lifetime. So this is being turned into a PhD project that my colleague Marlon, who's over there, and if you will have questions about it, please go to him, where we are trying to put this into a tool, digital-based tool, that addresses some of the problems with cascading impacts from multiple events into infrastructures. And I'm just going to give you a really quick view of how sort of things look. The idea is that the user will be able to insert their data and understand how vulnerable or how resilient their infrastructure is to different types of events. The idea is also to be able to visualize social vulnerability and to be able to update this as society changes, but also to visualize the hazards that the city is going to be living with in the future and how that impacts the well-functioning of infrastructures. Ultimately, I think that the messages in our project are about guiding, planning, and adaptation and mitigation investments. Today we see that a lot of these are happening based on a range of interests, not necessarily data, and definitely not taking into account the broader set of impacts that we can expect. Very often we have risk assessments on individual infrastructures over very short time frames. There are very few cross-sectorial and this type of more system analysis being done. And municipalities often have no tools or capacity to be able to grasp that system approach. So some of our key messages is that doing this type of mapping of infrastructure interdependencies can provide a more systemic view of not just vulnerability, but also how to increase resilience. Disruption analysis can indicate where mitigation investments should be prioritized, so you can reduce network vulnerability instead of addressing the symptom, which is often the case. And in terms of social vulnerability assessments, we advocate for a local level approach. Most vulnerability indices are done at the national level, sometimes at the municipality, sort of broader municipality level, but investments are being done locally and planning decisions are made locally. And so I think that the tools that we provide and the type of assessments that we provide should follow in this case where investments and solutions are needed. So this is it from us. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we're going to continue now this session with geopolitics, governance, security and defense. My name is Martin Jakobsson and I'm professor of marine geology and geophysics at Stockholm University. So I'm not a super expert on this topic, but working with marine geophysical mapping, you cannot help to be involved in this because the data that we acquire are often considered strategic, and we are often also consulted about different type of features on the seafloor, so it's impossible to not be related somehow to this topic. So we're going to have 3 speakers, and first up will be Niklas Granholm. Niklas Granholm is the Deputy Director of Studies at the Swedish Defense Research Agency in Stockholm. We can often hear Niklas commentating in radio, in public radio, a lot on security issues. Niklas is also a fellow of the Royal Swedish Academy of Naval Sciences and the Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences. So it's a lot of academies. And Niklas is going to talk about a new article from exceptionalist to security dilemma. Please.
Excellent, thank you very much. And thank you to the Royal Academy of Sciences for inviting me to speak about this topic, which has been really interesting, and I think we are getting, it is rising on the agenda, I would say, in several ways. What I'll try to do is to focus on drivers, actors, regions, and outcomes. And of course, we have been discussing earlier here the worsening physical climate change, which is leading us to a new Arctic. But there's also the combination of this with the worsening geostrategic security climate, which is also affecting the region. I'll focus somewhat on the big three in the Arctic, the actors, United States, China, and Russia, and their different perspectives on Arctic. On the Arctic. What happens when these three powers meet up in the changing region? The regions I'll focus on is the Euro-Atlantic Arctic and the North Atlantic. As we've heard earlier, the Arctic is not homogeneous. There are different regions that operate in a different way. So I'll focus on this part of the Arctic for the presentation today. And something on the outcomes. What are the implications for Sweden, the High North, the Nordic region, and also the North Atlantic? So first a few words about Arctic studies at FOI. We started doing this in 2007, and it was very much triggered by the Russian flag planting on the seabed of the North Pole. A number of FOI studies, conference papers, and book chapters are then available on this website, foi.se/Arctic. And the research themes you can see there: energy and mineral resources, the transoceanic sea lanes are opening up, the region's military strategic role is undergoing change. A number of external geostrategic influences are also affecting the region. We can also see the possibilities of changed sovereignty circumstances in the region, how it might affect it. There are a number of overlapping territorial claims. The international relations of the region has to be managed in some ways, and the cooperation in the region. And of course, actor and actor analysis, state and non-state actors in and outside of the region. I won't cover all these today, but of course they are part of what we've been doing here. So first to the drivers here, we can see a number of geopolitical changes going on here. And the overarching view is that there is a fast and relative redistribution of resources for power and influence on the global level. That is something that is something we can read about in the news almost every day, but it is going to change power relationships in the overall on the global level here. It also leads to a decreasing of predictability in the international system and a weakening of multilateral regimes, and that's particularly difficult for small and medium-sized powers. And on top of that, we have, as mentioned before, climate change that leads to more human activity up in the Arctic region. So it's the combination of these two that leads to the emergence, in my view, of a new Arctic. The picture here is what it, I think, and the captions almost write themselves here. You can see what they're thinking about each other. But that has all changed. And in 24th of February this year, we faced a strategic turning point with Russia's renewed attack on Ukraine. And the reactions were several. We could see clearly that the European Union and NATO were both united in support for Ukraine. A very strong sanctions were forced upon Russia. And this is something we'll begin to see the effects on. And we could also see that the transatlantic link, which had been, there have been question marks about it, was reinforced here. On top of that, Sweden and Finland realized that things had changed and applied in May of this year for membership of NATO. And importantly, European security, which we, up until the 24th of February, where we included Russia, trying to accommodate Russia and finding some kind of solution, changed. So now Russia is not being included here. Security is being built in Europe against Russia, not with Russia. This will have profound consequences on our security apparatus. And we cannot see clearly exactly what kind of strategic turning point Russia's attack on Ukraine will be for European security. But this doesn't stop there, but the Arctic region has already been affected, and what will the continued effects on the Arctic be down the line? A number of follow-on effects for the climate change in Arctic. I won't go into these here, but this is some of the things that we've been discussing here today and yesterday. The energy and mineral extractions, new transoceanic sea routes were opening up. There are a number of overlapping territorial claims. Fisheries will change. Tourism is increasing. The indigenous populations will be seriously affected. The question of environmental protection of the region, scientific research. We know that there's a lot we don't know about how the Arctic actually operates and functions. And there are a number of new actors interested in the region here, from the region, outside of the region. They are state actors and then non-state actors. We can also see a number of institutional developments and the changing military strategic role of the region as a factor. So a number of issues here to take into account. Looking at the big three in the Arctic here, the three very different major actors here are now active in different ways in the Arctic. United States, Russia, and China. And I will go through them very briefly here and see what that might entail. Starting to look at US Arctic policy, we can see this is now changing. And in the past 10 years, we can see an increase here. There's a much more active policy stance here. New icebreakers are being designed and actually built, even though they seem to be delayed. A number of policy speeches laying out what the policy towards the Arctic is. More of presence in the region, and not least importantly, a build-up of know-how on the Arctic has taken place over time. When we started with this about 2007, it was a bit wild and woolly, I must say. There were strange ideas about how things operate and what should be done. But these gaps of know-how has been gradually filled, and I think they are now quite up there with some of the best in the world being done here. Past 2-3 years, we could see new strategy documents being produced from the Department of Defense and followed by the different services, the Coast Guard, US Air Force, and later the Space Force, the US Navy, and the Army. So all the services now have a picture, an idea, and a plan on how they actually want to operate in the Arctic here. We can also see an increased interest in the Euro-Atlantic, Arctic, and North Atlantic region here, and not least regarding US Greenland policy in the past few years. We can also see that there have been changes in organization. The US Navy's Atlantic Fleet has now returned. It was disbanded in 2010 and came back in 2019 here. The question of how it's going to be resourced is another matter. But it also has tasks, apart from the North Atlantic, also up in the Arctic. So that's an interesting signal. And on top of that, NATO reinstated the Joint Forces Command Norfolk. So there is similarity to what we had in the Cold War that is coming back here. And of course, new polar security cutters or icebreakers are being built here. So this is a model of this one, which is delayed, I understand, but that's nothing unusual in this type of projects. So if you take a military strategic perspective on this from the US Department of Defense, how they see the Arctic region, they are clearly stating that the physical and security environment is under change and that this development cannot be ignored. And if the Arctic should continue to develop negatively, that could mean that there would materialize threats to the US homeland. This in turn could lead to limits of freedom of maneuver with US assets between Asia and the continental US and the continental US and the Euro-Atlantic theaters as a result. And this means that there is now a management issue, how to manage this, to modernize the capabilities. The distant early warning line was mentioned here earlier. And management of military relations between continental US, Alaska, Greenland, Denmark, and as well as Canada. And I would say also that the North Atlantic here is one of the regions in focus here. Turning to China, this was difficult to study earlier on because there wasn't really a proper strategy to start on, where we could actually start to see how things developed here. But since January 2018, there is now a proper Chinese strategy here to look at. And China defines itself as a near-Arctic power, whatever that is. It's not accepted by any of the other Arctic nations at all. And the core argument is that all the activities that China has undertaken vis-à-vis the Arctic should generate rights to operate, rights to take part in decision-making, etc., etc., which is causing unease among many of the other Arctic nations. We can also see that there's been, over several years, a search for footholds of different types. It's been tried on Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and not least Greenland recently. And there are, if you look at it, similarities to Chinese policies towards Africa and in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think this is a very interesting topic for study as well. How does actually China act here in the high north and the Arctic, European Arctic, compared to Africa and the Indo-Pacific? There's also the Polar Silk Road as a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, which now also has an Arctic leg here. We will see how this develops in the future, possibly not as fast and as much as everyone expected, but it's certainly there on the agenda. Central to this development is also Chinese-Russian relations. Is this to be described as an interest-based cooperation, or is it a fully-fledged alliance that we're seeing here? Or can we even say that it's a marriage of convenience of sorts? So I think that that's an interesting topic to study here on as well. And I think the jury is still out, and there is not complete unanimity on how this is actually to be viewed by others. And our institute have recently published some studies on this as well, indicating that Russia will be more and more into the coming more and more into the orbit of China here. We can also see that China uses natural sciences as an entry ticket into the Arctic region. Research stations on Svalbard has been around for a long time, and there are numerous other initiatives as well. The permanent observership in the Arctic Council is also a topic being used. It's a way of sitting at the table, not just behind the table, learning about how Arctic relations is actually functioning. And interestingly, there's also the interpretation of the law of the sea. There seems to be one policy for the Arctic. There must be no new dividing lines. This is the common heritage of mankind. Those types of wording are being used, which is the exact opposite of the policy in the South China Sea. So I think this is interesting. And the picture, of course, is the latest addition to the icebreaker fleet, the Snow Dragon 2, built in China after Finnish design. Turning to Russia and the Arctic, this map is what you see if you're a Russian planner. Very difficult situation, enormous distances, adverse weather and very long distances, and very much of a problem here to deal with. So what is Russia doing here? The long-term policy is one of strategic seclusion. And this term was invented by my colleague and friend Gudrun Persson at FOI. And this is seclusion towards the Western world and a resurrection of sorts of a Russian empire, or one version or the other, signified by inner repression, which we can see on a daily basis. There's no free press, there's no rule of law, other than what the ruler decides for the day, and also very clearly outward aggression. The melting of the ice has meant that there is a fifth strategic direction in the north that demands action here. You cannot just ignore what's going on there. So there's a slight similarity to what the US is saying here. Russia also has strategies declared for shipping, energy, and security in the Arctic, and they are much more focused and clear than in most other regions of Russia. There's also a naval and military rearmament. New bases are being opened, older bases are refurbished, there's an exercise pattern, new units are being set up, command and control arrangements are being looked over and changed. And there is an offensive stance here, and you can see this in the high north, Barents Sea and the North Atlantic. There's also other types of things used. History is used instrumentally, not least in deciding the role of the Svalbard Islands. So the Norwegian sovereignty is being challenged here in different ways. We already had fishermen and trappers there in the 17th century. So what do you mean Norway? Who really controls this? And a number of other aspects of this as well. And Russia signed the Svalbard Treaty in the 20s, but that was the young Soviet state under duress and so on. So they don't really like this. Plus a number of diplomatic initiatives now and then. Russia shouldn't be underestimated. They have substantial Arctic knowledge base, and this is something that's been going on for a very long time. Remember that they came up into the Arctic already in the early 1700s with Tsar Peter the Great. So they know what they're doing up there. The setup here in the Arctic, that changes with the attack on Ukraine in February. And I cannot stress this more enough, actually. This is going to play itself out in the next few years, how this is going to affect the Russian Arctic. Focusing on the high north and the Kola Peninsula base complex, that's, did you say 2 minutes? That's hard.
Go ahead a little bit.
I think I can go ahead here, but I'll skip some things then. But the submarine-based strategic weapons, that's central and existential to Russia. They have to maintain the nuclear parity with the US for as long as possible. This generates a cylinder of interest centered on the Kola Peninsula, reaching into Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the surrounding seas. And this is in order to have a control of a nuclear bastion to have a safe area for the launch of these strategic missiles. And also the energy and mineral extraction along the Siberian coast makes the sea lines of communication central or even vital. So this is how you can see it. This is a picture taken, constructed by my colleagues at RUSI in London. The Russian right hook is what we call it. And it means that the bastion in the north and the bastion defense reaches far south into the North Atlantic. So it is a right hook from Scandinavian perspective. So what does it mean for the European Arctic, the high north, and the North Atlantic? On top of the right hook, we also have what you could call, within quotes, balkanization. If Russia aims for the bastion and strategic cylinder, that's one part. And there's also force projection on the naval and air side, southwest into the North Atlantic. And the ambition is to create a new situation in the high north and the North Atlantic. Combined with Russian and Chinese activities in the region, that changes the setup. And I mentioned the US Navy Second Fleet and the NATO Joint Forces Command is coming back, changes in patterns, exercise patterns, basing policies, and resourcing, which is an issue here. The Nordic nations have rearmed, they cooperate closer militarily, and Sweden and Finland have applied for NATO membership. But we can also see a possibility of full independence for Greenland, but also for the Faroe Islands. That debate is also certainly there. And also post-Brexit Scotland. That may follow. It's a scenario, not a prognosis. And lastly, to spice it up even more, Northern Ireland, as a result of Brexit, we may have a new version of the Troubles in the making. So that complicates the region in a very different way. So two perspectives on security for the Nordic Arctic region here. What we have to do is to, in various ways, counter Russian activities in the high north. And ask ourselves what kind of military and security assets for the high north is needed. And how to organize Nordic and transatlantic military and civilian cooperation. For the Western perspective, Russian power projection in the North Atlantic is one topic. We have to make sure to counter Chinese and Russian activities in order to promote stability and avoid the risk of nation capture scenarios of smaller nations in the region. There may be possible independence coming, and we have to support this in various ways. We have to act as a kind of midwife if this process starts to accelerate. The question is then, will the existing cooperative fora that we have for Arctic civilian military cooperation continue in its present form? And how do we operationalize our Arctic civilian and military strategies? For Sweden's part, there's the new one from 2020. That's certainly there, very interesting wording in there, but how do we operationalize it? And we also need to think clearly about confidence and security building measures, CSBMs, for the Arctic as it is emerging. So we have had a shift here in the debate as well. So until recently, part of the debate focused on something called Arctic exceptionalism. Very different rules and setups applied in the Arctic from the rest of the world, especially in security and hard security affairs. Now the region is being discussed as a region with a security dilemma, and some kind of definition here. There are lots of them around. But this structural notion where you try to see the other party as a threat and you take countermeasures, and that party in turn sees it as a problem. So it's a prisoner's dilemma type of development here. And again, the combination of climate change and geostrategic conditions, that adds to the dynamic and complexity in security affairs here. So outcomes, conclusions, and issues here. And that's my last picture, Martin. We see a worsening global security climate, and that leads to an Arctic spin-in, I think you could say. Climate change will continue to affect the security situation for the foreseeable future, centuries even, as we heard from earlier panelists here. And I think that the big three states in the Arctic will set much of the pattern in security affairs. What we can do as smaller actors is to influence in the margin. And the current security climate that we can see here is increasingly detrimental to cooperative efforts and institutions for the Arctic. As we all know, the Arctic Council, the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, and the Arctic Coast Guard Forum have all been put on pause. No cooperation, or at least at very low levels, is taking part with Russia, but not any functioning cooperation here. And we can see this also in the science projects, and we had a discussion about this yesterday as well. So the issues for analysis here, could this be restarted in some way? What could the cooperation then look like? Pros and cons, plus and minuses. What could confidence and security building measures look like? How do we build those to avoid inadvertently getting into even worse trouble than we are now? And how can we use science as diplomacy as a part of this confidence and security building measures? So this is what I'll end with. Thank you very much. And this is a picture from Odin in 2013, and thanks to the Polar Research Secretariat, I got to go up there, and that's also an interesting part. Nature red in tooth and claw. Thank you very much.
We're gonna listen to Liselotte Odgaard from the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies, where she's a professor, and also a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute of DC. And Liselotte is going to talk about China engages the Arctic, a great power in a regime complex.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak here. I've certainly learned a lot that I didn't know before, and I hope that my presentation will be of interest to you. It's about China and China's engagement in the Arctic, and it's actually a couple of years old. We did the research. It was funded by the Danish Maritime Fund, which usually funds practical engineering projects and so on. So we were quite lucky to get funding to investigate if China is going to be a military power in the Arctic, because there has been a lot of debate about that. And our conclusion is that it's certainly not going to be a military power. But that doesn't mean that China doesn't have a significant role to play also in a security and defense sense in the region. And if you'd like to read more about that, I did the project with Taylor Fravel, who's a professor of Chinese security and defense studies at MIT, and Catherine Lavelle, who's an international political economist. So mainly that's what I'm going to speak from. I myself did a study on the prospects of Russian-Chinese cooperation in the Arctic, which was published in August 22. And there you can read about which areas Russia and China are likely to cooperate in when it comes to the Arctic, and why China has an interest in maintaining Russia as a strong military power in the Arctic. And I might also use some of the research from that. So if you look at China, they, as the previous speaker mentioned, they published an Arctic strategy recently, just a couple of years ago, where they coupled their strategy for the Arctic to the Polar Silk Road, just thereby saying that the global initiative for economic development and growth, the Belt and Road Initiative, would be extended to the Arctic region. And these documents are, of course, as much political as they are anything else. And one of China's purposes of coupling this was to say, we have significant interests in the Arctic that we're going to look after, and we will be in the region for the long haul. So they have kind of said, we're newcomers to the region, but we have legitimate interests, and we're going to pursue them. And those interests are focused on commercial interests, which China has. There's also some scientific, environmental interests, and there are some political interests. And this has already translated into a strategic presence in the region. And the areas we find that China focus on is the area of scientific research, it's the area of communications, and it's the area of transportation and navigation, and also extraction of minerals. By contrast, we argue that the military engagement is and will remain very limited. I have worked in the Arctic Command, so I do know that we occasionally see a Chinese submarine, but it's very difficult. It's near impossible for China to enter this region with their submarines without being detected, both because they have to go through waters which are very heavily surveyed for submarines by the United States, and secondly, they do not yet have submarines that are quiet enough to not be detected. So for various reasons, which you can find in there, it doesn't make sense for China to create a massive military presence. Of course, the main reason is that if you look at China's priorities, the Arctic region is very low on the list of their priorities. There's a lot of other things that come before this. Their influence in all of the Indo-Pacific region is, of course, their main interest. The Taiwan conflict, relations with Russia, pressure on supply lines, property sector problems domestically, too little economic growth. There is a lot of other issues that drives China's agenda, and the Arctic does come very low on that list. On the other hand, China is today a global power, and that's based on an economic presence. So China has a presence in all the world's regions, including the Arctic. And it always starts by entering a region with an economic presence, which is then translated into some kind of political presence. And that's also what China has done in the Arctic. But basically, we argue China is a latecomer, so it's one of the last regions it has entered, and it's facing a lot of resourceful Western NATO member states. That, combined with the fact that it is low on China's list of priorities, means that China does not have much of an interest in being difficult in the Arctic. Pushing agendas that the others don't like would be not very wise of China. What is wise for China to do is to strengthen Russia so that Russia can keep on bothering NATO. And it can do that in very low-key ways through financial and technological support, which is what Russia needs to be able to continue to bother NATO in this region. So that's basically ours and my argument. So what China does is that it pursues its own interests in this region through a mix of bilateral cooperation, and it very much plugs into existing regimes that are quite strong, as we've already talked about, on various environmental, scientific issues. And it's a benevolent presence, fundamentally, but because China, of course, also has an interest in, dual use of some of these facilities, there is sort of a black side to its engagement as well. So basically, China's preference here is for working within existing regimes to show that it can engage in problems that the region cares about, and thus bump up its legitimacy as a near-Arctic state. And then sometimes it also chooses to focus on bilateral cooperation, especially with Russia, where it feels that that's in its interest. So basically, this is interest-driven, and China's interest is to help Russia maintaining a strong position, but also to strengthen its own legitimacy as an Arctic nation. One of the areas we look at is navigation. And here, as the prior speaker said, China's arguments in some ways are the same as the US arguments, in that it uses the law of the sea to say that, everyone has a right to sail everywhere, because that's in China's interest in this region. It wants to be able to come here and to sail as many seas as possible, both for commercial reasons, but also, of course, to participate in and start scientific expeditions and whatnot, which allows China to also have situational awareness. And that situational awareness, it can potentially, of course, share with Russia, thus strengthening Russia's understanding of the environment from a security perspective. So again, there's this dual use purpose, which I don't think we can prevent, but just be aware of it. Militarily, of course, as China becomes a global power, it will also want to protect its interests with military power. So if China were to develop significant commercial interests in the Arctic, its military presence would reflect that. It would have patrol ships or something to protect those interests. but it's not very likely to have a huge presence from the look of it. So again, military presence, not so important. It does have a commercial interest in the shipping routes because it can save a lot of money if it can use them for freight. But that is, again, going very slowly, because even if the ice is melting, you know, they're not going to be year-round ice-free, and that means a lot of container traffic is just not commercially viable along the Northern Sea route, which is the one, as I'm sure you all know, is the one where the sea ice is melting the fastest. Nevertheless, the Northern Sea route is already a Russian sort of national waterway, and what they can use it for is, of course, export of liquefied natural gas, minerals, and other things. And they are working on doing or making transportation routes so they can bypass the West completely. So for now, the sea route to China goes through Korea, but they are building transportation infrastructure over land, so they don't have to go through that at all. And of course, Russia wants to divert a lot of its energy exports and mineral exports to China. It already does that, but it has to rebuild some infrastructure, so it will take a while, but this will happen, I'm pretty sure. And so there are these interests that are mutual in building out this Northern Sea route. So even if China is down or Russia is down and out with money, it will take some decades to realize their projects here. I'm sure Russia will now accept some of China's offers to build out the ports along the Northern Sea route, which Russia used to say no to because they didn't want too much Chinese influence. But now they will say yes to it, and China has demonstrated through decades of cooperation with Russia that they are going to hold back and not take over control. So they're not going to treat Russia as a little brother. Actually, China is already, in a couple of years, China has the capabilities to operate independently across all of the Northern Sea route and into the Arctic. We're told it has the icebreakers. It's also building now semi-submersible vessels, which means it can transport ships across the Arctic. And if Russia allowed it to have repair and replenishment facilities along the Northern Sea route in the ports, then it could operate independently. But China doesn't want to, because it would stir up too much negative attention, and Russia don't want it. And China understands to hold back, and that it's better for them to lie low here and instead help Russia to remain strong. So it's going to ensure that Russia has the money and the capabilities to continue to maintain control of the Northern Sea route as traffic increases and makes its assets on the Kola Peninsula more vulnerable. So this is the development that we argue would happen and that I argue in that late article. We've already heard about the contradicting interpretations of international law. So in the South China Sea, of course, China, for example, the strait between Hainan Island and the Chinese mainland, they will say that, you know, you have to report it when you want to sail through, even if it's just like, you know, an innocent passage. And that's the complete opposite of its argument in the Arctic. But there isn't too many people calling China's bluff on this. So therefore, so far, they just make different arguments depending on which region we're in. And there isn't really much debate about it, unfortunately. Yeah. Then there's the resource question. I've already mentioned that. They mainly have a bilateral approach, we argue, which is about cooperating with Russia. They, of course, are interested in their oil and gas, minerals in general. They have been able to keep political quarrels at bay for decades, and I'm sure they will continue to do that. The Ukraine war is a big test for them because that is about the last thing that China needed to have on their plate, because they risk losing their engagement in Europe, which they still need to get technology that they need, know-how, and for the investments in strategic infrastructure. And that's challenged. They've had to stop some parts of their cooperation with Russia to show that they don't breach the sanctions, etc. So they're very tired of that war, which also shows they can't tell Russia what to do. Nevertheless, this relationship will continue, and it will probably pick up when the attention is turned elsewhere, which is already starting to happen in the US, which is already getting tired of paying for weapons to the Ukraine. And yeah, China knows that. So they're waiting it out. And then this relationship will be fully blown, I think, again, unfortunately. So in the minerals, oil, gas, they mainly work with Russia because that's where they're welcome. But in fisheries, on the other hand, they've engaged in multilateral cooperation. They are part of the Central Arctic Ocean Agreement on Fisheries. And of course, that gives them influence on future agreements. They're in there, and that's generally China's strategy. They've made a big effort to be part of all multilateral structures, big and small. If they can, they'll try to take a leadership position because then they can determine the agenda. And for many years, there wasn't really any concern about China. So they're in there. They know what's going on, and that's what they want. They want to build an infrastructure for themselves, a strategic infrastructure, so that if in 20, 30 years, they realize, whoa, suddenly the Arctic is super important to China, they can just quickly bump up their presence. That's what they're doing. They're building a strategic presence, which may never be activated, but on the other hand, it may be. We don't know. For the foreseeable future, I think they just want to know what's going on, be part of the decision making so they can influence them again to look after their interests, but also to gain legitimacy and not be seen as a difficult party. The same goes on with the science sector, where they've been very active. They have funded research that is of global interest and of regional interest. They try to cooperate with all Arctic nations, again, to show they don't just want to engage with Russia, they want to engage with everyone. When their presence is challenged, they don't complain. So it's not like the Norwegian Nobel case where Norway was on ice. Here, and Denmark has experienced several times, we've thrown out the Chinese, not wanting them to buy old Navy bases, invest in airports, etc. And they don't say anything. And that's because it's not important enough to them. They don't want an argument over stuff that's not important enough. So they just retreat and wait for a better chance later, if they get it. Because again, it's low on their agenda, not worth the trouble. But we, of course, have these dual use concerns because they have managed to buy into some critical infrastructure. They're also, maybe as you know, they have pretty significant space capabilities for defense purposes, not just civilians. And, you know, to create the up and down links to the satellite, you really just need a building. So you don't necessarily need that much. And they have investments like that all over the Arctic. And again, the thing they can do with Russia is to share intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance data, and they increasingly do that. And that's a serious problem for us because it gives Russia a much better understanding of what goes on. So really, that's an area to be watched. So in conclusion, I would say that China tries to couple its interests to various bilateral and multilateral agendas in the Arctic, not just to sort of cater to its own interests, but also to show that it's interested in looking after the good of the whole. The fisheries agreement is an example, their participation in that, but also their funding of various science and environmental projects. And of course, it's in their interest to be accepted that they have a presence in the region, so that's why they do it. They're sometimes playing very low key with Russia, especially now, but they have done that all along because they don't want to be seen to be coupled to their aggressive agenda. Again, that's not in their interest. They have a different policy on the Arctic compared to the South China Sea, again, reflecting that the Arctic is not at the center of strategic competition for China. So they use their great power to reshape Arctic agendas and to nurture their image as a benevolent power. They haven't been super successful, again, because they're facing NATO countries with many resources to sort of push China out. But they don't mind it too much, as mentioned, so they're kind of, they're doing what they can, and if they're thrown out, they're like, okay, whatever. So their main game is probably, as I said, to keep Russia in business when it comes to security and defense in this part of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. So the next speaker will be online. It will be Annika Nilsson from Nordland Research Institute in Bodø, Norway. And Annika works on politics and Arctic change, communication at the interface between science and policy, and also adaptation to Arctic change.
I'm very, very sad that I cannot be there. I'm fighting a common cold and I don't want to spread the infection to the Arctic community of scientists here. But it would have been really great to see you all, many old friends and colleagues there. When you read the title of my talk, you probably think about the impacts of climate change and its implications for unique ecosystems, for shipping, for local safety, related to travel and food, and for the global climate. And this is really how we have talked about Arctic change for almost 20 years by now, with broader concerns slowly entering into the discussion, as Grete Hovelsrud pointed out in one of the sessions this morning, as Niklas Granholm also exemplified just in this session. Today, I will not focus on the impacts of climate change in the Arctic. Rather, I want to discuss how the challenges related to climate change and security not only hang together, but also are part of a much broader concern about navigating change, uncertainty, and surprises. When doing so, I draw on research on resilience and on notions of adaptive and transformative capacity, words that actually have already been mentioned here. I also draw on the notion of the ongoing changes in both nature and society, that they benefit from being analyzed as part of dynamic social, ecological, technological systems, or several such systems that are interconnected with each other, because, as we know, the Arctic is interconnected with the rest of the world. And now let's see how I can navigate on my screen here to get the next picture. Oops, one too fast. There we go. Here's one way to depict what I call a social, ecological, technological system. And as you can see, I put quite a bit of emphasis on institutions, which are an important part of governance, and how they link to power and the negotiations going on in politics, and to markets, knowledge, and social networks. But before delving into theory, I want to offer some reflections of where we are today. Even if we now see the impacts of climate change playing out in the Arctic and elsewhere in the world, and with much more far-reaching consequences for human well-being than we imagined 20 years ago, we also know that we're still far from dealing with the cause of the problem, the emissions of greenhouse gases. And we know, unfortunately, that scientific evidence has not made a major difference in the trajectory that we are on. And scientific evidence is unlikely to be a game changer in the immediate future. Furthermore, international governance, international climate governance is not delivering. And when it comes to my own faith in the potential for international cooperation on climate change, I'm much more pessimistic today than I was 20, 30 years ago. And we also know from experience during the past few years that both political and personal decisions tend to focus on the most immediate concerns. Everyone has had to deal with the health and economic impact of the COVID pandemic. And when this threat started to subside, Russia invaded Ukraine, and attention turned to security concerns, and not only issues related to military security, but also migration, food security, and energy security. And on top of that, a realization that the international mechanisms for conflict resolutions that we have put our trust in are facing a completely new reality, and a reality for which they were not designed. The Arctic, of course, is not immune to any of this. An immediate impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine was that the Arctic Council activities were put on hold, which we've also been heard about already, and indeed that all circumpolar organizations had to reevaluate cooperation with Russia, which we heard about yesterday. And I think it's too early to assess the full fallout for scientific cooperation, circumpolar, and knowledge about the Arctic, but it's not going to be without long-term consequences. Another impact with implications for the Arctic is the need to shift away from Russian oil and gas has come as kind of a brusque wake-up call. Suddenly, the demand for other sources of energy is increasing rapidly, potentially speeding up the EU's Green Deal transition, which, by the way, is at the forefront of the EU Arctic strategy. One ambition in this latest iteration of the EU Arctic strategy is to work towards a ban on all fossil fuel extraction in the Arctic, an idea that was criticized by Norwegian commentators when the strategy was launched about a year ago. And today, of course, Norwegian gas has become one of the sources of secure supply for Europe. And in the short term, the security implications include much higher level of attention to the need for protecting the integrity of energy infrastructure, including drilling rigs and pipelines. However, the EU's long-term goal remains, and which is good for the climate, and the longer-term transition away from fossil fuels will also have security implications for the Arctic in economic terms, and for everyone whose economy builds on extraction of fossil fuels in the Arctic, from people who may lose their jobs to municipalities whose economies are built around hydrocarbon extraction, to regional and national economies. What has happened in Alaska in recent years illustrates how a downturn in the fossil fuel economy affects everything, including basic social infrastructure such as education. Another part of EU's Green Deal, and emphasized also in its Arctic strategy, relate to securing the supply of metals, including rare earth elements, that are needed for many of the non-fossil energy technologies. The Arctic is rich in mineral resources and is already an important supplier to the EU, but efforts are underway to make it even more important, with plans for various initiatives that would make it more attractive to open new mines. From an EU perspective, this would help secure the supply of material from nearby and friendly states, in contrast to conflict areas or to China, which is currently the major global supplier of rare earth elements, and with increasing control also of the supply in African countries. The Swedish daily Dagens Nyheter yesterday quoted the head of the Swedish state-owned mining company LKAB saying that Sweden can become Europe's China. However, if you look at from a local perspective in the Arctic, the security implications look quite different than from an EU perspective. They include threats to the local environment, such as impact on water and biodiversity, which is of course why new mines require environmental impact assessments. However, there are also socially complex security implications that are not captured in environmental impact assessment. And most important might be those that relate to conflicts at the local and national level, not seldom accompanied by lack of trust in governance and institutions as they look today. And see if I manage to change. No, now comes the picture. It's a little bit delay when I try to change the picture here. Mining is already a source of conflict between different local interests and between local actors and national and international interests. A major reason is that mining and the infrastructure surrounding it is not compatible with other uses of the land, including reindeer herding. The picture to the right is taken outside the old Kiruna City Hall in connection with the ministerial meeting of the Arctic Council at the end of the Swedish chairmanship in 2013. And I think it says a lot about the different perspectives on the Arctic and who makes decisions and when and where. The situation in Arctic Sweden, and it's not unique, is currently one in which a limited amount of land is meeting an unlimited demand related not only to mining, but also to wind power farms, tourism, conservation interests, and military activities. And when the need for metals to secure a green transition in the EU and the need for local jobs are invoked, interests related to reindeer herding and nature protection do not always weigh very heavily. And this comes on top of a long history of industry claiming land that has earlier had other uses. It also comes on top of other old conflicts over land use that are now heating up, not least those related to forestry practices. And the situation is actually becoming quite sour with local social tension, as well as racism and hate crimes against Sami reindeer herders in Sweden. And I don't know the situation in other countries, but in Sweden it's popped up quite a bit. From local scenario workshops that have conducted in several Nordic locations in the Nordic Arctic, I can also conclude that there's a mistrust towards national and international actors and institutions that the political tensions may be an increasing concern in making what we usually call a green transition. I don't think that simple solutions such as giving money back to the communities will solve this mistrust. Rather, we must take seriously how security is perceived from a local security point of view. Is there enough of a tax base to fund basic social services and infrastructure, which is often not the case in the Arctic? Is there long-term job security that makes it attractive for young people to stay and develop their community? Even in boom times, civil society meets challenges. Where the current rapid industrial development in northern Sweden is a case in point. Industry jobs pay very well compared to working in schools and healthcare, which is draining education, social services, and healthcare of personnel. At the same time, the influx of workers from elsewhere is competing for housing to a point where it's been impossible to recruit teachers from other parts of the country. We heard earlier about infectious diseases may be increasing in the Arctic, but whether an infection is a major health problem or not, of course, not only depends on the disease agent, but also if you have access to healthcare and getting relevant treatment early. And that is affected by a lot of other factors, including the intricate issues that are happening now within rapid industrial development in the Arctic. I think that we need to keep such local social security aspects in mind when we discuss energy security from an EU perspective. We also need to get away from only responding to the most immediate surprise, be it a crisis or a potential opportunity. Indeed, responding to surprises has often been how external interests have related to the Arctic. We heard Niklas talking about the 2007 sea ice minimum and the political ripple effects with implications for resource extraction and shipping and governance. The rest of the world came knocking on the door on Arctic Circumpolar cooperation at the same time as it became important for the Arctic Council member states to assert that they indeed were the Arctic countries. Today, in the wake of combined climate and energy security crisis, actors again from the south again turn their eyes towards Arctic resources, especially metal, but also land for wind power and water for hydropower. I think that as a result, the Arctic will face a global energy transition in the next decades that may lead to major transformations of regional and local social, ecological, technological systems. The regime shift for the Arctic as a region may actually be as profound as the development of the Arctic oil economies that took off in the 1970s and 80s, or from a Swedish perspective, the building of the current mining economy in the early 1900s. The security implications for people living in the region may be profound, and the outcomes, positive or negative, are likely to be closely linked to our ability to address real conflicts between different interests, global, national, and local, but also across different priorities within local societies. I'm not sure how, but given the mistrust is a real issue, I don't think we can afford to look at the Arctic only from the outside without involving those who are directly affected by the decisions made. I also think we need to prepare for new unpleasant surprises. We probably cannot predict what they will be. Scientists with the best knowledge failed to predict the 2007 Arctic Ocean sea ice minimum. Other experts in a completely different field knew that somewhere along the line a global pandemic would hit, but the preparedness in society was close to nil. And vulnerability to Europe's energy supply shouldn't have come as a surprise, but it appears that neither countries nor individual households or businesses were sufficiently prepared, with system-level knock-on effects on economic development as a result. We're still in the midst of this and don't really know the full consequences. We also don't know what the next surprise will be. Always having to respond to the next crisis is not a way to build long-term security, but is a result of having built a society that has favored immediate efficiency, rapid material growth, and high rewards for investment at the expense of building common preparedness and safety nets. And in the Arctic, this development has historically been accommodated by with eroding traditional indigenous networks and sources of knowledge, including languages. And what we now must ask us is how further activities in the Arctic can build an underlying resilience to navigate change and unpleasant surprises, rather than erode the features of society and nature that provide the buffering capacity that we need to maintain security when crisis strikes. The notion of resilience is often used when in connection with discussing shocks and potential tipping points in the regime shift, when a system reorganizes itself and into the new stable state. One could describe the desecuritization of the Arctic and the building of the circumpolar political and scientific cooperation it's a regime shift in international politics from the earlier Cold War situation, what Lars Otto talked about, mentioned a little bit yesterday. And a regime shift I think most of us would describe as positive. not only for international politics, but also locally in the Arctic. But not all regime shifts have positive consequences. And we need to be on the lookout for the features of Arctic social ecological technological systems that can hinder or enable them, or help us navigate the needed or inevitable transitions into something new. And as the picture shows, it's not only the size of the shock, here the push on that ball in the basin, that matters. It's also the strength on the underlying resilience, how deep or shallow the basin in where the ball is pushed, that matters. And that is something I want to develop a little more. So what do I mean by resilience? Another way of saying the same thing is adaptive and transformative capacity. There are many ways of classifying its main features. The IPCC, for example, discusses adaptation constraints and enablers. I often use a framework from the Arctic Resilience Report, which Grete Hovelsrud, by the way, was part of developing, where we develop this image to capture the most important sources of adaptive and transformative capacity. The focus in us is on cultural, natural, social, human, and financial capital, along with infrastructure and knowledge assets. And I think this applies equally well to security. And it's no coincidence that this is not a list of features, but depicted as nodes in a web, because they are interconnected. And as with all webs, the strength of the web lies not in the single node, but in the combined strength. I believe that these are the aspects, and these aspects are the most important resources we have in the Arctic, the resources that we need to protect and strengthen in order to safeguard not only adaptive and transformative capacity, but also long-term security in the Arctic. And we need to ensure that our ambitions in relation to military security or the transition away from fossil fuels do not erode any of these nodes or their connections. Thank you.
It's been a super interesting session, and now we're going to move over to the very, very last bit. And before we do that, I'd just like to remind everybody that this is a collaboration between the Norwegian Scientific Academy of Polar Research. I'm part of it, but I still have to read it because it's so long. And that this was actually a collaboration that started in Svalbard, and you mentioned Svalbard, and I think that's almost symbolic that we started it there. And if I'm not wrong, it was 2018, right?
Yeah.
We had a visit there. Leif talked a little bit about it before, but we had a visit there with this class, geosciences class, that went up there to meet the academy, and the outcome became actually that we started this. We had an idea of making something together, and I think it's been phenomenally nice. It can't be better to have Grete Hovelsrud, who is the president of the Academy, or the Norwegian Polar Scientific Research Academy, or whatever, turn around the words, to round up and let us know where we're going next.
Oh, I only wish. Thank you, Martin. Yeah, it has indeed been 4 years since we decided on the topics for this symposium. But the 15 talks and the great discussions that we've had over the last 2 days show that our initial plan was quite good, and perhaps more relevant now than it was 4 years ago, I would say. Because the hiatus created by the pandemic, I need to have my notes because I had so many different things to say. The hiatus created by the pandemic and the current war in Ukraine are driving home the importance, I would say, and value of collaboration between scientists, between countries, and between academies. And the value and importance of sharing of data and scientific infrastructure we've also talked about here. We never will solve the data sharing problem, but we must never forget it either. And half of the Arctic is now out of the loop with Russia, and data is likely lost from Russia, and scientific infrastructure like ships and others in
in half of the Arctic is largely unavailable. And so we have to start preparing for how to pick up the contact and collaboration with our Russian colleagues once the war is over. We can't wait until the war is over and then decide what to do. So we have to start talking about that. The topics addressed at this symposium, I believe, I will not go through them all 15 talks and summarize, but just briefly mention that they are of interest beyond our two academies and beyond the policymakers and the scientists in the Arctic. What happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. The Arctic continues to go through major changes with consequences along many dimensions in the Arctic, but also with consequences for the global south. So if we talk about the, nice opportunities with a little bit warmer in northern Norway, well, that means that it's a lot hotter for someone else on the other side of the globe. So it's not like we are, it is exceptional, but it's not the exceptionalism is there, but it's also related to the rest of the world. And I think the urgency of doing something about climate change is even more prevalent now than it has been to date. And we can just cross our fingers for a positive outcome for the ongoing discussions at the COP27 in Egypt. But it's not only about climate change, as we've heard. Climate change effects are tightly linked with social, cultural, environmental, political, geopolitical concerns and environmental challenges and opportunities. And as we also heard, the consequences intersect and are cumulative and compounded. So while the Arctic is a geographic region which lends itself to comparison from a scientific point of view along dimensions of impacts and policy processes, we also have to think about the high variability within the region and between the multiple Arctics that we're dealing with. Thinking about that was this irreversible loss, the clear and present danger of irreversible loss and a future Arctic that may be unrecognizable to us along many dimensions, environmental, economic, social, geopolitical dimensions. I think it's very, very sad and very profound, very gloomy indeed for those of us who've loved the Arctic since age 5. And for anyone else who likes the Arctic. So this is something that we will continue this conversation in Oslo in March 2023. I wish I had the exact dates, but I'm still waiting for some of you to answer the dates. So this is when the Norwegian Scientific Academy for Polar Research is hosting the twin to this symposium. Same topics, different speakers, different perspectives. And I think this will broaden our knowledge base even further. I believe the general public is interested in our findings and discussions. And I propose that after our symposium in Oslo, we invite the speakers and moderators to prepare texts for publication in a popular science book for a more general audience. There are many interesting things happening here that I think will have relevance and interest out there. So with this, I would like to thank the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences for hosting this symposium. It's been very well organized and very welcoming, and not the least thanks to Peter Brandén and Gunilla Grunditz and the staff here at the Royal Academy. I think we should give them And I also wish to thank the planning committee, of which I'm one, but I can thank myself too, with members from both academies. And I look forward to welcome you to Oslo in March in 2023. Thank you so much.